The Middle Ages, spanning from the 5th to the 15th century, was a period of enormous transformation politically, socially, and intellectually. It was a time in which the Roman Empire was crumbling, while feudalism was taking hold, and Christianity was spreading, eventually giving way to the Renaissance. But one of the most significant components of that period was its education system, or lack of one, in some ways. It was an era in which most people were illiterate or had little access to formal education. The educational was closely linked with religion, the social and economic system, and was affected and influenced by the relationships and dynamics between social, economic, and religious traditions. Today we are going to be studying education. In the Middle Ages, we'll discuss why it was mostly only members of the nobility who were taught, the influence of monasteries and the church on education, what they actually taught and how they taught, as well as the problems that medieval societies faced in trying to keep people educated, social structure and its impact on education. The basis for medieval education was social in its every dimension. On top of this pyramid stood the nobles and clergy, for whom education was frequently the right of inheritance. This wealthy group of aristocrats typically got a formal education, either from private tutors or by going to the finest religious schools. For many people, education simply wasn't, or was not, a priority. Education was a luxury, and the vast majority of peasants and serfs were forced to till the land and raise families without any formal education to speak of. The church was an important part of the educational scene. Christianity reached all aspects of life, and so too with education. Religion. For most of the medieval ages, education was a religious matter. Until the late medieval period, monasteries were among the few institutions that maintained literacy and education in Europe. Writers and readers were scarce, but among them were the monks and some of the nuns to whom was entrusted the education of the children in noble families, and the priests. Feudalism and the organization of knowledge. Medieval society was dominated by the system of feudalism, an economic, political, and social system where land and resources were the primary source of power and wealth, and people swore fealty to their overlords. As a result of this system, the creation of rigid classes was established: kings, lords, vassals, peasants, with each class conducting its appropriate work, and each class receiving its appropriate education, according to which echelon in the social hierarchy one was born into. The sons and, occasionally, the daughters of the nobility were frequently the best educated, generally trained in those systems of knowledge which would help make them skillful leaders and warriors or wise governors. They would be taught such matters as chivalry, rudiments of Latin, since it was the religious language, and in rare cases something of philosophy or the classics. Their training was focused more on practical training than theoretical or empirical study. The children of the peasantry, on the other hand, had no access to formal education. The vast majority of them would learn to do useful things such as farming or animal husbandry or carpentry that were useful skills to have in a feudal society, a time when people were more inclined to learn on the job rather than from books or from someone else. Establishment of education during the medieval period. The Church GCBO's contribution to the education to easily the single most important organization on the education of the Middle Ages was the Church. The Christian Church wielded not only religious power, but political power and influence, which permeated nearly every aspect of daily life, education included. The Church thought that you couldn't live a virtuous life without religious education plus, so it was in charge of the reading, writing, and interpreting of sacred texts. The first institutions that could be described as schools were dedicated churches by the early Middle Ages for monks and priests to teach. The term school is hardly descriptive of the education systems that the monasteries developed and the purpose of education during this time. These schools were established to train generations of clergy as readers and exeges of Christianity's sacred texts, and most of the curriculum was dedicated to religious studies. Monks specifically were commissioned to be the custodians of the written word. During a period when there was as yet no printing press, monks painstakingly copied handwritten manuscripts, thus preserving the heritage of the past for the posterity of the future. This preservation was essential, especially when a lot of the understanding from the Roman and Greek era was lost or disregarded during the medieval ages. Universities also developed during the Middle Ages, and many were established by the Church. They were designed to teach subjects including theology, law, and medicine. but was still very religiously based. Italy's University of Bologna, established in 1088, is one of the oldest. The early universities in Italy were focused on Roman and canon law and the devout study of religious texts. Cathedrals, as schools, European universities took their lead from the monasteries, but also great European cathedrals become seats of learning. These cathedral schools were usually administered by clerics or monastics and offered schooling at basic, intermediate and advanced levels in the trivium of grammar, rhetoric and logic, and the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, music and astronomy. The education there was more formal than one would find on a rural or feudal estate, but was geared mainly to the training of clergy. Cathedral schools were later established in the 12th century to serve as the main source of education, leading to the expansion of the modern university and further centralization of learning with its attention to deadlines, specialties, standards, and more formal, state-regulated learning as a distinct and institutionalized form of cognitive experience. The curriculum, beyond religious studies, theology, the study of God and religious texts, was the dominant subject in most schools, and from the 13th to the 16th century was essentially the only subject taught at most of the universities of Europe. The major sources for this study were the Bible, the Church Fathers, specifically Augustine and Jerome, as well as biblical commentary. The language of the Church and of the educated class, Latin, was also an important component of education. In addition to theology, there was the indispensable study of the 7 liberal arts. These derived from a common core: the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium, grammar, the rules of language, primarily Latin; rhetoric, the art of using language effectively in speaking and writing; logic, the art and science of reasoning and argumentation; the quadrivium, arithmetic, the art of computations; geometry, the mathematics of space and shapes; music, the science of harmony, rhythms, and the laws of ratios as applied to music; astronomy, the science of the stars and cosmos. These subjects were meant to teach students about the world and how to think rationally, but the emphasis continued to be religious interpretation, and these sciences were only applied to theology, the role of the universities. And so, just as we saw that universities began to emerge in the 12th century, as I pointed out, during the medieval period, the universities of Paris, Oxford and Cambridge were considered a glittering corridor for the sons of the European aristocracy to obtain a high standard of learning. These universities were inspired by the cathedral school model and spread quickly, specializing in theology, law, and medicine. They would, over time, start expanding to other areas, like philosophy and the natural sciences. The bachelor and master system, which became antecedents of contemporary university degrees, were essential components of medieval universities. To become a master, a student had to maintain a lengthy course of study, submit to a series of questions, and compose theses to demonstrate their ability to think. Medieval schooling. Medieval education section IIFYP sensitizes us. IFYP tells us that 4/5 of our young people could be helped a little. As a model, the educational system of the Middle Ages was well organized and highly developed, but it was full of drawbacks. The largest obstacle, though, was access. There may have been some Jewish women who attended school and studied in medieval times too, but very few of them, and for most people in the culture of the Middle Ages, there was no such thing as school. Rural dwellers also had little access to formal education. Chobnami did not in fact reach the masses, for the majority of people were illiterate, and education was a preserve of the urban elite or the clergy. There were 2 other big problems. One was resource shortage. Monasteries and cathedral schools tried to maintain knowledge, but they had limited resources. Books were extremely expensive and scarce, and only the richest people or organizations could afford to buy them. It wasn't until the 15th century that a printing press existed, and books then had to be copied by hand, a labor-intensive task that took time to produce. To sum up, throughout the Middle Ages, education was mostly a privilege, and the Church did play a great part in it. The system was dominated by religious studies, and reading and writing were controlled by the elite and clergy. But through these difficulties and the infrequency of access, the dependence for the emergence of the Renaissance and rebirth of classical thought was established. Medieval education has had a lasting impact on Western universities and Christianity, but what ruined everything? Around something like the 5th to the 10th centuries, The early Middle Ages was a time of massive disruption in Europe. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476, the Western world was left in disarray, and struggle, disunion, and other forms of government disruption occurred throughout the region. Those schools which existed in the Roman Empire collapsed, along with the general level of education. Yet, in the background, some things were moving which were soon to result in the recovery of education in Europe. The most relevant imprint of these was that of Christianity and the Church. The decline of Roman systems, the end of the Roman Empire, may be seen to mark the end of the wedding between the formal and the non-formal, since the structures that had historically supported formal education, notably Roman schools, libraries, and philosophical traditions, no longer existed. In the west of the empire, use of Latin, which had been the language of administration, law, and literature, to a large extent broke down. This loss of a common language and culture also impeded intercommunication of the new ideas by rendering the intellectual life that had characterized Roman society nearly impossible, with the result that a large part of the learning of the classical world was lost, and most of the population, particularly in the countryside, became illiterate. Schools, in particular those in rural or remote areas, disappeared, and intellectual attention turned from mind gym to the business of survival in a fractured and fragmented society. This led to illiteracy, and learning was restricted to the rich, powerful few. Yet formal education waned, and intellectual life died. Out in the early Middle Ages, Christendom is noted for the survival of the literate population. Christianity and the survival of Western culture preservation fell to the Christian Church, and the Catholic Church in particular, as one the last of the non-localized institutions that crossed local kingdoms and empires. The Church was to become the preserver of learning in the West. Monasteries and convents were educational and intellectual centers of medieval Europe. When education was received, the monks, nuns, and clergy were oftentimes the only individuals who knew how to read and write, so they were the ones who took on the responsibility of teaching. This education was closely related to religious education, because the Christian faith was an integral part of life. Most monasteries were places of learning and scholarship, as monks prayed, meditated, and also transcribed and saved ancient texts. Monastery schools, and the emergence of literacy, one of the important early Middle Ages learning institutions. The monastic school, Samonsky school, monks provided much of the learning in addition to their spiritual roles. These schools provided some of the only access to schooling at this time. The order of Saint Benedict was of such great influence on the early medieval period's universities because it had emerged during the 6th century as one of the most important Western monastic orders and militated against the exacting methods of the medieval education establishment. The rule of Saint Benedict laid the basis of monastic life of the monks and nuns of the Western world. Monasteries and convents obeying the Benedictine rule frequently contained scriptoriums, rooms where manuscripts were hand-copied, and libraries that contained numerous ancient texts, including works from the classical period, the Bible, and Christian theological writings. In these early monastic schools, reading and memorization of the Bible was emphasized above all else. Latin, the church language, became the language of teaching, and therefore, many churchmen who received an education learned to read and write Latin. Knowledge of the scripture was important in order to know the will of God. The Carolingian Renaissance, a short-lived revival of learning while knowledge was in many ways extinct during the early Middle Ages. There were exceptions. One major such event was the crowning of Charlemagne as Franks' king and his later ascending to the throne of Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in 768. It is perhaps in its educational system, then, that Charlemagne's government was most in evidence. Charlemagne knew how important it was to have educated people, and under his rule, learning was revitalized. His efforts are called Carolingian Renaissance, a time of cultural flowering and increased learning. During his reign, Charlemagne built schools and showed interest in the education of the clergy. He also called scholars to his court from all parts of Europe, who undertook to copy and preserve ancient manuscripts. The Carolingian Renaissance is also credited with preserving numerous ancient classics, which might otherwise have been lost. The schools of Charlemagne, called palace schools, were those organized at his court in Aachen, but their operation was felt in all parts of the empire. These schools were dedicated to the study of Latin, grammar, rhetoric, and Holy Scripture. They were instrumental in ensuring that education of the clergy was maintained, and they would evolve to be the predecessors to the cathedral schools of the later Middle Ages. The work of the clergy in education before the rise of the universities in the High Middle Ages. The clergy were the civil service, and often the only professionally educated people in any community. Partially this was because religion was considered the most valuable form of knowledge, but partially it was because monasteries and churches were some of the only institutions that had the resources to educate anyone. There were also church schools, in the sense of studies or instructions given to candidates for the priesthood, which were held at monasteries and cathedrals, and generally attached to the local cathedral and monastic schools. It was the role of the clergy, especially the monks, to preserve and promote learning, since they were the only people who knew how to read, write, and decipher the holy books. Alongside their religious education, this clergy also received an education in Latin, required in order to read the Bible and the writings of the Church Fathers. The Church's involvement in education wasn't just to save Christian knowledge. They were also instrumental in safeguarding classical texts from the ancient world. During the medieval period, the authority of the Church as a source of knowledge would be increasingly challenged. But in the early Middle Ages, it was a repository of learning that turned to cathedral schools and the first universities during the early Middle Ages. A great part of the world experienced a period of total stagnation and decline, when few were interested in learning and education was left to the monks. These institutions were directly affiliated with the cathedrals of larger cities and gradually evolved in order to provide a more organized curriculum with a diverse selection of subjects, especially as population and urbanization increased. The cathedral schools were important not only because they had formalized religious instruction, but more importantly because they extended it beyond basic religious instruction to other fields of study. Theology was their main focus, but pupils were also instructed in Latin grammar, logic, and rhetoric. The educational system came to take on a more modern shape, and cathedral schools were a bridge across the end of antiquity and the beginning of the university system in medieval Europe, led by the University of Bologna and the University of Paris. Cathedral schools also were significant in the training of clergy and education of notable sons. It was these schools that really succeeded in reinforcing the status of Latin as the common language of educated Europe, and in ensuring the continued dominance of the Church in the realm of ideas. Conclusion: the early ages were a period during which there was a very limited amount of organization and formal learning after the empire fell. But despite the enormity of the difficulties of the time, the Church, in particular the monastic institutions, was to play a vital role in the preservation of knowledge, the continuation of literacy, and the transfer of learning. The education offered during this period was predominantly religious, consisting of Christian literature, religious studies, and Latin. But it set the stage of an intellectual revival that would take place later in the Middle Ages. During the Carolingian Renaissance, Charlemagne established a library at the court in Aachen, and with its collapse all humanistic studies that we can be certain made up this library dissolved. Many of the materials were saved and brought to Rome, and others to enslavement in Ireland. Decreasing inspired the nexus of education with the Church. These misguided actions resulted in the martyrdom and suppression of the Ionian St. Alcuin, and the completely virtual dissolution of education in the West, 400 to 1000 AD, during the Middle Ages, which being an exceptional access to education was the wild point of the need for education. The school systems in place in the Middle Ages in the public life by the Church was born there were no real examples of education models. The Roman Empire had left a vacuum in formal education, due in part to the collapse of the Roman Empire in Western Europe, and the Church filled this void with the establishment of a network of medieval universities, monastic orders, and cathedral schools. The topic of this chapter is the monasteries and cathedrals of antiquity and the High Middle Ages, in education with their influence on the intellectual future of Europe. Monasteries, the lifeblood of medieval education. It may be said that monasteries were the leading educational institutions of the early Middle Ages. After the Roman Empire had fallen, the Church was the only unifying factor left in Europe, and its type of community was the only preserved institution. So in many cases Christianity, it was the only civilization left as well. These monastic schools were instrumental in preserving literacy and understanding in a time the rest of Europe referred to as the Dark Ages. Most religious and cultural life was structured around monasteries. They were havens of knowledge in which monks copied manuscripts, studied Christian theology, and preserved ancient texts. Nor can the educational role of the monastery be exaggerated. These were people who preserved the heritage of classical Greece and Rome, and who made sure that their church fathers, and the other works of theology that a Christian should know, lived to see another day. The rule of Saint Benedict, and its influence on education. Significance of monasteries in the development and preservation of culture is due in large part to the rule of Saint Benedict, created in 529 by Saint Benedict of Nursia, and clearly rejected the kind of organization that gymnasia and other community interests triumphed, providing which the resources and culture was based upon. Saint Benedict's monastic order was dedicated to a balanced life among prayer, work, and study. Through the Benedictine rule, education became central to the monastic way of life, and monks were reading, studying, and copying texts, wrote, copied, and compiled an enormous variety of devotional and historical works that were integral to the oeuvre of medieval monastic culture. They preserved the manuscripts of ancient Latin literature. They would be employed in scriptoriums, special rooms where manuscripts were hand-copied, and they would also organize libraries, some of which were repositories of knowledge critical to works of literature, medicine, philosophy, and science. Such devotion to scholarship was necessary to arrest the decline of the knowledge of classical antiquity. The education in monastic daily life. For education in Benedictine monasteries, it should be emphasized that education was not an isolated work but formed part of the daily life of the monks in Benedictine monasteries. Study and reading and writing were required of all monks, though the focus was religious, and monks and nuns studied the Bible and Christian doctrine. They also learned Latin, the language of learning, and the church. Monks would also study the 7 liberal arts: grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, a classical education designed to help them understand the world and, by extension, the divine order. This was not only the education of the clergy, it was also that of many young men drawn from the ranks of the aristocratic families who entered monasteries for education. With passing of centuries, the function of monasteries as seats of learning started developing. Monasteries not only protected the Bible and religious works, but also were centers of study and research in science and philosophy. While these monastic schools were designed to prepare future members of the higher clergy, they eventually paved the way for the secular schools that would develop in the later Middle Ages. The rise of the cathedral schools as a step towards education of a higher type. Even though monasteries played a significant role in the conservation of literature, cathedral schools represented the second, more progressive tier in the development of medieval education. Cathedral schools originated from the monastic tradition, becoming more urbanized in the burgeoning reputation of the church in the cities where they were from, and Daddy would focus on the education of elites, particularly those destined to serve at the royal or episcopal courts, who would ensure the students in their traditions than ordinary or common. Cathedral schools were the earliest form of tertiary education in Western Europe and elsewhere, and provided the model for the first universities. Tightly organized and relatively narrow in curriculum, the instruction was theoretical, often to the point of overestimating the understanding of the uninitiated. These early schools, later followed by the monastic schools, and then by the Scholae Palatinae and the later medieval universities, had 3 programs: the trivium grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic; the quadrivium arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy; and the preparation of the young for the priesthood. These schools were based on the 7 liberal arts and concentrated on a Latin education, which was largely aimed at literate clergy of the time. Yet as town life revived, the cathedral schools extended their curriculum to include philosophy, law, and natural science, the first universities, Studium General, and the origins of university education. Many cathedral schools gradually established themselves as places of higher learning. Some, such as those at Paris and Bologna, have been recognized as Europe's first universities. From cathedral schools, the transition to universities was a rather noticeable modification in the course of education in the Middle Ages. The universities were affiliated with the church, but they functioned as autonomous organizations on the model of the modern university, with whole communities of students and faculty. These were universities at which advanced study was conducted, ordinarily in the fields of theology, law, and medicine. Among these earliest universities are the University of Paris and the University of Bologna. Both institutions derived from the cathedral school tradition and were formed at least essentially to train an educated clergy educated in the church. In these early medieval universities, the Theology Act was the lion's share of the credit, as it was considered to be the queen of the sciences. But with the passage of time, these universities broadened their syllabus to other disciplines such as the study of natural philosophy, law, and medicine. Its early institutions had jealous regard, like that of the Athenians, for uncitizens of its learning. 106 Paris FR, someplace in France, where there was a university. Exchange name of town for name of the university that is placed in your town. One founded about the end of the 12th century, and was one of the most celebrated in medieval Europe, numbering among its pupils some of the most distinguished of the clerical and scholastic teachers, and the greatest of the statesmen and commanders. Of the Middle Ages, the name Paris greatly fluctuated from time to time between that of Byzantium for the eastern and Aachen in the west. Its theological schools educated numerous foremost intellectuals of the time. Similarly, the University of Bologna, founded in 1088, focused on legal studies and became a role model for other law schools in Europe. Those institutions were the forerunners of the modern university, and the curriculum then established is not dissimilar from what we have today. Information note available in English language students started with a simple education in liberal arts before entering in more complex academic world, especially in the fields of theology and law. The course of instruction in the monasteries and cathedrals, the monastery and cathedral schools, then were designed to provide for the spiritual and intellectual needs of the medieval Christian world. The 7 liberal arts of the ancient Greeks and Romans were taught in these institutions. The trivium derived from I trivia, meaning the 3 ways. The initial stage of learning was a combined curriculum called the trivium that included grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. That again was grammar, of the kind that formed the object of study for Latinity, whereby alone, in the Middle Ages at least, a knowledge of Latin could be attained, either for reading or for writing, particularly with a view to religious uses. Rhetoric prepared students to speak and write persuasively, and logic to reason and debate. The trivium was the beginning of education in the Middle Ages, and it was a prerequisite to the quadrivium for further study. The quadrivium, the second stage, the quadrivium, consists of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These subjects were considered necessary for apprehending the world of nature and the divine plan. Arithmetic taught numbers as the object of study, while geometry concentrating on that of space. Music was a mathematical science in its proportioning of harmony and rhythm, and astronomy involved the science of the motions of the divine bodies of stars and planets. In the monasteries and cathedral schools, other subjects were taught, such as biblical texts, doctrine, and the language of learning and liturgy, Latin. Over the centuries, other secular subjects, such as philosophy, law, and medicine, were added gradually. The place of monasteries and cathedrals in medieval learning. Monasteries and cathedrals were in the medieval period places of education of great significance. These religious centers kept learning alive when much of Europe was cut off from formal education. They preserved the achievements of classical thought so that future scholars could expand upon them. The Church, as educator, also created one of the most distinctive educational forms that survived through the Middle Age. It nurtured a distinctive worldview that brought the Christian faith into dialogue with the wisdom of the ancient world, and that animated the life of the mind in Europe's medieval past. In addition, as cathedral schools developed into universities, a new dimension was added to education. Rather than being confined to complete ignorance at the pleasure of his overlord, a European could gain an advanced, specialized education, intellectual transfer and codification. Besides formal education, monasteries and cathedrals also helped to pass knowledge down through the ages. Through copying these texts, they guaranteed that the ideas of the classical world, including the works of Aristotle, Plato, and the other Greek and Roman philosophers, would live on to influence later generations. In periods like the Renaissance, these preserved works made possible a revival of intellectual life during the 12th and 13th centuries and helped shape Western thought in the later Middle Ages. Conclusion: to sum up, monasteries and cathedrals were the heart of medieval education. They were those that preserved knowledge and led to the recovery of Europe in the intellectual sense, fostering religious study and texts, while later providing the groundwork for the foundation of universities. Monasteries and cathedrals were not only implemented in the education of the Middle Ages, but were also instrumental to its formation. Although they were originally intended to provide for the religious instruction of the Church, they were also a system of education that would grow up and open the path for the universities of the Middle Ages and of the Renaissance. The intellectual life of Europe, such as we know it today, is in no small measure the legacy of the monasteries and cathedral schools, where knowledge was conserved in a time of volatility and obscurity. The High Middle Ages, which also corresponds to the period of the 11th–13th centuries, was a time of great intellectual expansion in Europe. Monastic and cathedral schools were among the first institutions of higher education, as the education buildings of new universities were just being begun. These were the universities, and they were to provide the foundations of medieval education, on which the pattern of education in future times would be modeled. The development of universities brought a more organized and less provincial structure to higher learning. In this post, we'll be discussing the origins of universities in the High Middle Ages, the way they organized intellectual life, and the enduring effects they had on the history of education in Europe. The emergence of universities, colleges, and univ significantly from this lineage. Another point is that existing universities were founded in the High Middle Ages, and only already existing cathedral schools were established as universities, and continuation of this natura traquea. The students, too, continue to be instructed at the cathedral or collegiate church, since there was no dormitory aspite. The earlier Mont remains a matter of debate. Center. Varied, agreeing with the episcopal privilegiation that making the modem university is an extrapolation of existing practice, making it a deductive and empirical creation. But extension reflects breadth of episcopal cathedral or religion privilege for cores of students, true or false, and it was the conclusion of this, what we can call the speculative method, was that university privilege reflects the habit of having introduced students on occasion, signifying what already exists, and fulsomely. Both 4 and 5, important recognition that we still must make concerning the privative self-rud. Theme of the students, and the corporate magister and student. Conc. Re.play. What then became known for us as the university were not the universitas French during the 13th century. While European populations grew more urbanized and commercial and trade exchanges mushroomed, the need for education beyond the limits set by religious instruction increased. Over time, the Church, that was long the arbiter of the intellectual enterprise, began to accommodate by nurturing the creation of universities. The first real universities sprung up in the 11th and 12th centuries and focused mostly on two things: theological study and clergy training. Universities grew up in the cities that were already major religious and intellectual centers, and they drew students from across Europe to learn more. University of Bologna, 1088. It is commonly said that the University of Bologna in Italy is the oldest in the world. Founded in 1088, it is the oldest university in continuous operation, as well as one of the leading academic institutions in Italy and the world, and a school of history and philosophy. Originally, the University of Bologna, as its name suggests, was a law school, and also was a school of regard to Roman law and the study of theology. That is called canon law. Although it was closely associated with the Church, it was the first school whose interests were more legal than theological. One university, in particular, played a significant role: the University of Bologna, one of the earliest to grant formal degrees. It became the model for modern universities. It was different from school. It was to be ruled by the students. Its students were largely involved in managing the university, an uncommon arrangement in medieval times. This model was then copied in universities all across Europe, including in student or faculty groups in later centuries. Paris, University established in 1150. The University of Paris established itself as one of the leading and historic universities in Europe. Like Bologna, the University of Paris concentrated on theology, but it also provided higher education in the liberal arts, philosophy, and law. Its theology school was attended by adherents from all over Europe, bringing students like Thomas Aquinas and Peter Abelard. The University of Paris was also home to scholasticism, a system of learning that sought to reconcile faith and reason. Scholasticism was largely based on Aristotle's writings, which were translated into Latin by articulate people so that they might be better understood. The scholars at Paris achieved a rigorous logic and ratiocination designed to bring forth certainty and to demonstrate the truth of Christian dogma. The model of the University of Paris in many respects established the norm for other universities, since its emphasis was placed on theology and the liberal arts. The curriculum was very rigid, and there was a sharp separation between undergraduate and postgraduate students, with degrees being granted on their completion of level-based rigid prompted coursework. Oxford University of 1167. There isn't an exact date of the establishment of the university. However, many times it is estimated to date back to around the 12th century. It's one of the world's oldest and most renowned universities. In its early years, the Oxford curriculum closely followed the Paris model, focusing on the study of liberal arts and theology. But as England's political and intellectual climate matured, Oxford's scope broadened to comprise law and medicine, both law and medicine being necessary to the state and health of the kingdom, as in Paris and later Bologna. Oxford also became a major seat of debate, and from the mid-13th century on dispute, and developed the system of the disputation and quodlibetal questions in the medieval university. Its citizens, faculty, and students gained a reputation for scholasticism, and the university soon outgrew its city walls to become a hub of some of Europe's most influential minds. Medieval universities, form and content. Medieval universities did not look much like the modern institutions we have today. They were not open to all, but in general to a tiny minority, also known as an elite of clergy, nobility, and rising urban elites. Universities were initially for the training of the clergy, yet gradually their curricula began to include the other fields of study like law, medicine, and the natural sciences. Their structure was hierarchical. At the top, faculties and schools for different subjects within the philosophy as a whole, and more general types of knowledge. Below them, the individual teachers and students, who were everywhere crowded together. These faculties were meant to include two general categories: the higher faculties, theology, law, and medicine, and the lower faculties, the humanities, including the liberal arts. The superior faculties covered the most highly regarded areas of learning and conferred the most distinguished degrees, whereas the inferior faculties taught the rudiments, such as grammar, rhetoric, logic, and the arts of calculus, arithmetic. The trivium and quadrivium higher education within medieval universities was based on the classical 7 liberal arts, adapted into the trivium grammar, rhetoric, logic, and the quadrivium arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy. The trivium introduction students usually started their studies with the trivium, or 3-part curriculum, which prepared them in the fundamental skills for all intellectual inquiry. Grammar allowed students to learn Latin, a necessary language for an learned discourse. Rhetoric taught students to argue effectively and persuasively, while logic allowed them to reason in an organized manner. The quadrivium came later on in a student's ever so disciplined life, and it was all about math and the physical, not social, universe. Arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy were deemed necessary for comprehending the order of the universe, and music became a kind of harmonical mathematics, revealing divine principles. In the medieval period, however, even in the universities, the 7 liberal arts continued to be all that were taught, and the immediate and efficient cause of the addition of the other 3 is easily explained. Theology, termed the Queen of the Sciences, was the centerpiece of medievally educated scholarship at the former, and scholars sought to make reason and faith all-embracing through a method called scholasticism. Law, both civil in Bologna and canon in many towns, was particularly studied at university centers, and medical schools characteristically brought Salerno, the first European town to make its mark in this faculty, into prominence. The degree system. The medieval universities introduced the degree system and discipline-based higher education. Students had to complete 6 years' worth of studies at a university and be sufficiently versed in the subjects to graduate. Degrees took years to earn, and students were frequently required to complete oral exams and write a thesis to show their knowledge. The 2 primary degrees were the bachelor's and the master's degrees. A bachelor's degree followed successful completion of studies in the liberal arts. For a master's degree, students then undertook studies in a school or faculty, like divinity or law. A titter of conversation followed, which became more animated when Helene announced that a master's degree was the sort of accomplishment that conferred upon a scholar the right to teach at the university, to offer his own lectures to students. The impact of universities on European society. Schmidt v. The medieval universities. The medieval universities increased in power and influence, and came to be more and more influential in the development of European intellectual life and culture. These institutions were more than just havens of ancient learning. They were also centers of cutting-edge thought, among other areas of philosophy, law, and science. The medieval universities, which were oriented toward theology and the liberal arts from their inception, gradually added other fields of study and inquiry, law, medicine, and the natural sciences, and set the stage for the intellectual effort of the Renaissance. Universities were important in the preservation of classical learning and the training of a new elite of educated professionals, scholars and theologians, influenced by the teachings of ancient philosophers such as Aristotle, went on to teach or write research and statements of belief about it, and the outcome was to produce a modernizing effect on the new and reviving European society. Their effects can still be readily seen in contemporary universities, and the impact they have had upon Western thought is beyond measure. The High Middle Ages saw a flourishing of intellectual exploration in philosophy, with the rise of logic, philosophy, theology, and the natural sciences. Alongside the rise of the new universities, one of the most significant intellectual phenomena of the 9th century was scholasticism. Scholasticism was an approach to education that tried to reconcile faith and reason, using reason to better understand and explain religious truths. This intellectual system was the prevailing orthodoxy in the medieval universities and dominated much of the intellectual discourse of the period. In this lesson, we're going to discuss the origins of scholasticism, its main actors, the prominent ideas driving it, and the impact it had on the education and intellectual life in the Middle Ages. We'll also look at how scholasticism affected what came later in the Renaissance and beyond. The origins of scholasticism. The scholastic movement took place within the framework of the 12th and 13th century Renaissance, in which learning was revived and codified, though it had its antecedents in the system of patristic theology on the one hand, and in the maintenance of the dialectic as a favored method of discussion on the other. One of the primary causes of the Hermetic occultism that characterized the early Renaissance has been identified with the return from the Crusades in the 11th century of the writings of Aristotle. After the Roman Empire fell, Aristotle was all but forgotten in the West, but in the 12th century, his works were retranslated from Arabic into Latin, putting his ideas within reach of European scholars again. The first group of scholastic philosophers tried to combine Aristotle's thought with Christian belief. Aristotle's focus on reason and logic, especially in his ethical and metaphysical writings, appeared to contradict Christian theology based on divine revelation. Scholastic thinkers, by contrast, imagined reason and faith as potentially harmonious, and set out to show how the truths of philosophy and theology might be integrated. The Church's function in scholasticism. The Church was also certainly not an enemy of scholasticism. The scholastic intellectual framework denied that faith and reason were in conflict, and also that reason, being a part of God's creation, could contribute to the knowledge of the mysteries of faith. This theological method opened up the possibility of employing Aristotle's system of logic in disputation and exegesis of Christian doctrine. Speculative possibility. Some of what is known can be made more clear and more systematic, though reason dragged this to the concept about religious truth being clear by reason. Scholastics thought that if they applied reason to the examination of mysteries of faith, they would obtain a deeper comprehension of God's nature and the universe. This intellectual journey was regarded as a step in every Christian's spiritual path. Key figures in scholasticism. The leading figures of scholasticism are not just Springlander refuses to recognize in single case, whole personality. They were important influences on the development of scholastic method, the rise of medieval schoolmen, and the decline of pagan thought in Western Europe. Here, we take a look at some of the key figures of scholastic philosophy. Anselm of Canterbury, 1033 to 1109. Read more. Anselm of Canterbury is sometimes considered as the first of the scholastics. Although he had not elaborated the scholastic method, his writings prepared the way for later scholastic development. The Proslogion, in which Anselm approaches God through the concept of ontological argument, is his most famous work. This argument, that even the idea of God as the greatest possible being presupposes his being, would later be one of the bedrocks of medieval philosophy. Anselm's theology was rational and rationalistic. He held that human reason can comprehend and prove, if not the totality of Christian revelation, at least the great truths of Christianity. His work was to provide the basis for much later scholastics, and in particular would be extremely influential in the philosophy and theology of St. Thomas Aquinas. Peter Abelard, 1079 to 1142. Another influential figure in the rise of scholasticism was Peter Abelard, 1079 to 1142. One of Abelard's most well-known works is the Sic et Non Latin, Yes and No, in which he extracted contradictions in church doctrine and then tried to apply reason to judge between them. Abelard's approach was to place divergent views on a subject side by side in order to meticulously work through them and achieve a clearer view. Abelard also authored a book on ethics, especially on his moral intention theory. He asserted that the moral value of an act did not derive solely from the outward act itself, but from the intention that lay behind it. This conception was to have an impact on later medieval ethics and moral philosophy in the scholastic tradition. Thomas Aquinas, 1225-1274. Thomas Aquinas is without question the best known and most powerful in the field of scholasticism. His integration of Aristotle's philosophy and Christian theology gave rise to an intellectual tradition that bridged medieval and modern scholasticism. The hero of the scholastics was St. Thomas Aquinas, whose greatest book, Summa Theologica, is a huge collection of Christian theology in which he tries to make the teaching of the Church agree with the philosophy of Aristotle. Aquinas held that reason and faith do not contradict each other but blend. He maintained that reason can demonstrate the existence of God and elucidate some of divine revelation, but it could never comprehend all the mysteries of faith. His writing on the existence of God, ethics, and natural law became a cornerstone of Christian philosophy and later had a great influence on English and British philosophy and science. Aquinas' contrast of logic and reason with theological truths was characteristic of scholasticism. His synthesis of faith and reason, along with his moral teachings, became central to the education of the Catholic clergy. Duns Scotus, 1266-1308, and Duns Scotus, a Franciscan theologian and philosopher who was one of the most influential scholastics in metaphysics. Scotus is noted for his exploration of the nature of being and his formulation of the doctrine of univocity, according to which terms such as being or existence can be applied to God and creatures with the same meaning, making possible a more immediate comparison between divine and human realities. Scotus also participated in the discussion about the possibility of a will free from necessity, contending that human beings are free, that they are able to choose to do good simply because it is good. It had a great impact on the further development of scholasticism and would be cited in the Renaissance and beyond by later philosophers. The scholastic method. This method of scholastic was an exacting system of thought which used examination and logic to use dialectics, or the ability to debate and argue, but more the art than anything to solve theological and philosophical quandaries. The method often started with a question, sometimes a theological or philosophical question, and then opponents would try to argue against a proposal followed by those in opposition to the views of their opponent. The philosopher would then, through reason and logic, try to reconcile these contradictions and produce a conclusion. Among one of the most well-known uses of the scholastic method is the Summa Theologica, written by Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas would ask a question in his Summa Theologica, such as to whether God exists, add a list of objections, and then gives his own answer and solution. This was as tool of dialectic for the thorough and systematic consideration of the more difficult theological ideas, to ensure a full examination of all its phases. There was a tremendous structure and ritual around the scholastic method, and it's said that on a few occasions scholars would berate and attack each other with great ferocity in order to sharpen their arguments. This method taught critical thinking and was by far the most highly advanced mental system in the medieval era. The scholasticism and the medieval EONIVRSITIS, the structure and curriculum of medieval universities, were significantly inspired by scholasticism. The scholastic education of the period placed more emphasis on the development of mediating institutions between the individual and the institutions of state and synod, such as the coherence and connectivity of all branches. of knowledge and the importance of philosophy and theology. The emphasis on logic, dialectics, and reasoning also shaped the way university subjects were taught. In the medieval universities, it was imperative for students to become proficient in the scholastic method and practice proper argument and discussion. The logical and rational perspective encouraged intellectual atmosphere to sieve and refine the thoughts. This approach to thought left its mark on the subsequent development of science, philosophy, and theology. Scholasticism also fed into the method of study known as the scholastic method, where students of the liberal arts at universities studied a number of disciplines including logic, rhetoric, grammar, metaphysics, ethics, and the natural sciences. The kind of inquiry encouraged at the universities was modeled on that of the scholastic, and the arguments and disputations that occurred in the exchanges of medieval lecture hall foreshadowed the intellectual revolutions to come. Scholasticism, in decline in its legacy, although scholasticism continued to be a major intellectual power in the Middle Ages, its influence waned in the later medieval period, to be replaced by humanism. The triumph of humanism that favored the study of classical texts and the self-creative individual drew attention from the scholastic method and the domination of the religious point of view on learning to a more secular, empirical one. Nevertheless, scholasticism continued to exert an influence on Western thought. The method of dialectical reasoning and the focus upon logical analysis have also had significant effects on later philosophers and theologians, and many of the themes that are developed in scholasticism are still identifiable in contemporary philosophy and theology. Conclusion: the strong influence of scholasticism, particularly with Gregorian sacralism, is noted at the high time of the Middle Ages in education and the founding of universities. Scholastic thinkers like Anselm, Abelard, Aquinas, and Scotus appeals to reason, where faith, or revelation, was considered to be the found for reason, who unlocked intellectual breakthroughs for both philosophy, science, and theology. Approach to inquiry inspired by scholasticism's dialectical reasoning and recourse to a systematic method of logical analysis. Socratic questioning is a key part of the educational system in universities' attack on tradition schools. In the Middle Ages expanded this treatment, teaching of both questioning and taught by conversation using disciplined conversation. The legacy of Socratic questioning to medieval scholasticism stands in stark contrast to its decline in the Renaissance, with the advent of Cartesian and Kantian skepticism, although scholasticism eventually was replaced by other intellectual movements. Saiger's situation was part of the dangerously dynamic early chapters of what we know as Western thought. Those who received an education in the Middle Ages were predominantly men, although women of the upper class were allowed to attend private schools and learned to read in convents. Sometime before the Renaissance, women's education in medieval Europe was, for the most part, the domain of the Church, which considered that women were best socially under their control and actively discouraged true learning. But in spite of the immense obstacles to a formal education, women did make significant contributions to intellectual endeavors in the Middle Ages. Here we examine what it was like to be a woman at school in the middle incomes and billion, the type of institutions that helped women access an education, and some influential women who managed to brave a patriarchal system to become scholars, writers, and leaders. The lack of education for women in the Middle Ages. Due to domination of society by the males, women were generally limited to homes, and education was not deemed necessary, except at an elementary level, to prepare them for marriage and thereafter homemaking. That is why women used to be barred from any education when boys were being taught. If girls of noble or royal families did receive private education, they would only see academic knowledge as an addition to their awaiting life as a housewife, a mistress, or an educated woman who has duty to her house. But what little knowledge women did learn was limited to those believed to be conducive to managing a home. This type of work included all those goods and services that were usually done in the house, such as cooking, weaving, spinning, and child-minding. In other situations, richer women might be taught to read and write, especially if they were from a very religious Christian family, as such a family might value literary knowledge for religious reasons. But by and large, women were either illiterate or only had some formal education. Religious education, a men's monopoly, on the field of women's slack, in a culture largely dominated by Christianity. Religion shaped education and educational institutions. The only type of education available to most European women during the Middle Ages was religious instruction. The Church educated women on religious matters, and many religious women and some lay women became literate as a result of their participation in religious life. Religious brotherhoods and convents were some of the few places for women to receive an education. Nuns in convents were allowed to read and write, and some of them received an education that resembled that of a well-educated person in the world. Beyond the convent walls, and some even became well-educated and influential within religious and intellectual circles. The Church also, notably through its orders, created the possibility for women to access education and spirituality. Convents and monasteries were houses of religious scholarship, and girls who joined them could study the Bible, religious history, and, occasionally, classical literature. In religious orders, women frequently copied texts, and some convents emerged as significant repositories of learning alongside their male monastic counterparts. Abbesses and learned women. In monasticism, abbesses, or the heads of the convent, were some of the few women authorities in the Middle Ages, and among the few women in general who could be Many abbesses were intelligent and well-educated, and their communities regarded them as wise interpreters of scripture. Some abbesses even operated their own schools, teaching nuns and sometimes laywomen of the laity. Their academic roles were essential for continuing the traditions of literacy and learning. At a time when formal education was largely available to males, one of the most famous was Benedictine abbess, composer, author, and philosopher Hildegard of Bingen, 1098 to 1179. As the religious superior, Hildegard was also an intellectual who wrote works on theology, anatomy, medicine, and natural history. She was held in high esteem by intellectuals and clergy, and her writings on natural history, medicine, and spirituality, as well as her courtly connections, made her one of the most renowned women of the Middle Ages. It was a deep spiritual education Hildegard received, but she was also well read in the classics, and she maintained correspondence with other intellectuals across Europe. Another woman may be cited, namely Christine de Pizan, 1364 to 1430, the Venetian-born French poet and scholar who has been regarded as one of the earliest of professional female writers of Europe. Although Christine did not belong to a monastery, she was extremely well read and wrote books on the role of women in society, the importance of a women's education and political philosophy. Her most well-known work, The Book of the City of Ladies, is a meditation on the nature of women and the feminine in society, and is extenuating of the misogynistic depiction of women in many other medieval writings. The position of women relating to education except for the clergy. Religious education remained the main form of learning available to women, although there were exceptions, and some women in the 12th century began to attend classes outside of the convent. Girls from the nobility, in turn, were often educated by tutors at home, focusing on good manners, languages, and accounting. These women were frequently capable of reading and writing in Latin, French, or the vernacular, and reading some, but not all, religious and secular literature. But it was exceptional if a noblewoman got the same kind of education as a nobleman. They had received a more applied education designed to help them run an estate, care for children, and prepare to be wives and mothers in a patriarchal world. On rare occasions, women of noble, e.g. or royal families, might be educated in the more scholarly manner. Isabella I of Castile, 1451 to 1504, for instance, was educated and literate, and had a significant impact on Spanish history. Isabella was both a monarch and a patron of the arts, letters, and education. Her reign was accompanied by political stability and great advances in society and culture, leading to her being called La Santa, the Saint, due to her rule that stood in contrast to his predecessor's policy of religious tolerance. Instruction women. The relationship between life and knowledge in the Middle Ages 256. Women, and the emergence of universities and life, began to get even tougher with the appearance of universities in the High Middle Ages around the 13th century. Educational opportunities for women were very few. Almost all of the universities were primarily male institutions and did not enroll women. However, a select number of extraordinary women managed to get an education. Admission to universities was possible in very rare cases, for example, as one was disguised as a man or due to family connections. One of the most studied physicians from around the world was a woman called Trotula of Salerno, c. 1090-1163, entre 4. 11th century woman possibly related to Salerno, the great medical school in Italy during that age. Trotula is thought to have written numerous important manuscripts on women's health and medicine. Although virtually nothing is known about her life, Trotula has been the subject of analysis by some scholars as an early and significant example of a woman who made a substantial contribution to the field of medicine in a time when most scientific knowledge was dominated by males. Another famous figure is Dorothea de Tarco, who allegedly attended the university in Bologna in the 14th century and received a degree in medicine, decades before women were allowed to attend the university in the strict sense of the term. Dorothea reveals possibility for women to pursue higher education, if they were able to do so at all with extreme difficulty and unique circumstance. Literacy of women and their literary demeanor. Formal education was often impossible for women to attain, but many of them became literate, even if they were not educated in a conventional manner. Many educated women, and literary women in particular, they were disproportionately from well-off families, read and wrote in Latin, the language of scholarship, and some wrote poetry, letters, treatises. There also were women who assisted in the writing and copying of manuscripts, whether or not they depended on male guidance. A certain number of women, such as Heloise 1101 to 1164, the famous scholar and mistress of Peter Abelard, were renowned for their intellectual accomplishments. Heloise, who was a woman of great ability and who became abbess of the convent of Argentea, her exchange of letters with Abelard, which she had been forbidden to publish, was a bestseller from the moment it was passed from hand to hand, and her surviving letters are repeatedly proclaimed to be the most brilliant literary accomplishment of the Middle Ages. But other women, including Heloise, the English mystic Julian of Norwich 1342 to 1416, were also among the most important writers of the time. Julian's Revelations of Divine Love was another. Julian's spiritual works, written shortly after being visions, place her on a level with other mystics in the Christian tradition. Conclusion: women in the Middle Ages were not afforded the same quantity of formal education as men, but they did have some access to it. Convents and monasteries, in particular, became a key proponent for women's education, particularly as it pertained to theology and literature. Nevertheless, a number of women rose above the prevailing attitudes and had a major impact on the intellectual and artistic climate of their era. Women's works by authors such as Hildegard of Bingen and Christine de Pizzi, as well as women's efforts in the fields of literature, medicine, and philosophy, meant that medieval women had help in reclaiming the intellectual Middle Ages. Indeed, their achievements are little known, despite the fact that one cannot fully comprehend the evolution of education and intellectual life in the Middle Ages and beyond without them. There was little education for women, but the impact these women had on intellectual history is considerable, and their influence can still be seen today in many academic traditions such as scholarship, theology, and literature. Most of medieval education and learning was then Roman Catholic, and the Western University was merely one place. The Church collected knowledge in the early Middle Ages, the Islamic world, and the West Grade 6 plus the Islamic world, which flourished. From the 7th to the 15th centuries was an intellectual golden age that deeply influenced Western thinking. The works of Islamic scholars, scientists, and philosophers also contributed to the intellectual revival of Europe in the later Middle Ages. This chapter will analyze the impact of Islamic scholarship on the medieval educational system, the transfer of learning from the Islamic world to Western Europe, and the major scholars and discoveries that define the intellectual environment of this period. We will also consider how the collision between Islamic, Christian, and Jewish intellectuals set the stage for the European Renaissance. The Islamic Golden Age and its intellectual legacy. The Islamic Golden Age, spanning the 8th to the 13th centuries, produced a flourishing of scholarship and learning in the Muslim world. Great centers of learning abounded in cities such as Baghdad, Cordoba, Cairo, and Damascus. It was an era in which scholars in the Muslim world developed experiments, investigated the world around them, explored the heavens and the mind, and pursued the accumulation of knowledge in subjects as diverse as science and religion, astronomy, medicine, chemistry, philosophy, and theology. These accomplishments of the mind would later reach European shores, and in part inspire the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. The discovery and passing on of the works of the ancient Greeks and Romans was assured by Islamic scholars. The writings of philosophers such as Aristotle, Galen, and Hippocrates were translated into Arabic language and were studied intensely. Muslim authors also went beyond these early phases of hacking and into original inventions in these areas, crafting complex theories and systems which would eventually be passed to Europe. Mathematics and astronomy. Islamic scholars had a major impact on medieval education in the areas of mathematics and astronomy. Islamic mathematicians introduced a number of fundamental algebraic concepts, which is the major source of algebra, a word that comes from the title of the book, which set the discipline of algebra. Al-Kitab al-Mukhtasar fi Hisab al-Gibarwa al-Muqabala, written by the Persian mathematician Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, 780 sampai 850. Al-Khwarizmi's work also paved the way for solving equations by symbolic algebra, a concept that became fundamental to modern mathematics. These also developed trigonometry or Euclidean geometry. Al-Khwarizmi, d. 846, and other scholars contributed to the systematic development of their inventions. Their writings were translated into Latin and studied by European scholars, especially in the 12th and 13th centuries. The adoption of Arabic numerals, with their efficient notation for zero, fatally undermined the previous clockwork mechanism of computation, and the near-revolutionary treatment of one number as being made purely from another number of times contributed to the ensuing extensions of modern integral calculus, elaborated on product log. In astronomy, the Islamic scholars developed the works of the ancient Greek astronomers and increased their comprehensions. The astronomer Al-Battani c. 858 c. 929 revised Ptolemy's astronomical tables, improving the knowledge of the movements of the stars and planets. His writings were eventually translated into Latin and studied by European astronomers, such as Copernicus. Ibn el-Haytham, 965-1040, also known as the father of optics, also contributed significantly to the understanding of light and laid the foundation for further progress in optics and astronomy in both the Islamic world and Europe. Medicine and chemistry. Islamic academics likewise had an influence in the science of medicine. The Persian Bimaristans were an early example. In the East, the Persian physician Avicenna ibn Sina, 980-1037, wrote the Canon of Medicine, which became the standard medical text at many Western universities and remained in use as late as 1650. Avicenna's compendium integrated Greek, Roman, and Indian medical knowledge and included his own contributions in the fields of anatomy, pharmacology, and treatment of diseases. Another historic Muslim doctor was Al-Razi, 865-925, who came up with significant knowledge in the diagnosis and treatment of diseases. He was the first to differentiate smallpox from measles, and his contribution to chemistry set the stage for advancements that followed. His Kitab al-Hawi was a comprehensive medical encyclopedia that was translated to Latin and studied in European universities. Muslim scholars also made great strides in chemistry, or alchemy, as it was then called. Other figures, such as Jabir ibn Hayyan c. 721-815, wrote 3 volumes on alchemy, including extensive directions for processes such as distillation and crystallization, which have since passed down to the study of modern-day chemistry in Europe. His theories about the elements and chemical reactions served as a basis for subsequent European alchemists, including Roger Bacon. The impact of the transmission of knowledge to medieval Europe. The transmission of learning from the Islamic world to Europe was achieved largely through a second conduit, not by travelers along the roads of the first, but in the translation movement of the 12th century. Meanwhile, European Christian scholars were rendering critical Islamic works into Latin, thus making them available to their European counterparts. The 12th century translation movement was even more focused in Spain, especially in the former capital of Islamic Spain, Toledo, captured by Christian armies in the 11th century. Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars at Toledo's renowned school of translators cooperated in a collective effort to translate a large number of Arabic texts into Latin, the general language of learning in Western Europe. These books consisted of philosophy, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and sciences. Rendering of these texts into European languages provided access to the views of Muslim scholars such as Avicenna, Al-Razi, and Al-Khwarizmi. The introduction of this new wisdom had a great influence on the revival of learning in Europe. It served to spread the revival of learning and the new spirit of the Renaissance. in Western Europe, and it became a model for a pedagogy reborn of the sciences and the humanities rather than the scholastic tradition. It is that Arabic numerals and mathematics Arab people in the history of mathematics. Amongst the lingering imprints left by the Islamic world upon medieval Europe is the use of Arabic numerals. Europe had previously been using the Roman system of numerals, which was not conducive to calculations. The Hindu-Arabic numeral system, which included the concept of zero, was first introduced to Europe in the 12th century when Arab mathematicians brought the system from North Africa. The writings of the mathematician Al-Khwarizmi were translated into Latin and taught throughout Europe. His systematic method for solving linear and quadratic equations led to later ideas like that of operations research, and Arabic numbers made mathematics easier to apply. Crusades, exchanges of science and ideas between the 11th and the 13th centuries. The Crusades also contributed to the exchange of knowledge between Islam and Christian Europe. While the Crusades were fundamentally armed pilgrimages, they initiated cultural and intellectual exchange that helped shape the global village that much of the world exists within today. European crusaders in the Holy Land, when they arrived, were exposed to advanced science and medical practices by the Islamic world. Many of these crusaders returned home to Europe with fresh ideas, books, manuscripts. These writings were commonly translated and analyzed by European scholars, precipitating more of the exchange of ideas between the Islamic and Christian hemisphere. People who passed on knowledge. Various personalities served as the intermediaries for the passage of Islamic knowledge to Europe. One of the most well-known translators of Arabic texts into Latin was the Italian scholar Gerard of Cremona, 1114 to 1187. He translated into Latin the writings of Avicenna, Arazi, and other Muslim scholars, thus disseminating their ideas among European scholars. The Jewish philosopher and physician Moses Maimonides, 1135 to 1204 of Spain, was another important mediator of Islamic and Christian thinking. Maimonides was deeply influenced by Islamic philosophy, especially the teachings of Avicenna and Al-Farabi. His works in Jewish philosophy and medicine expressed Islamic ideas to Jewish and Christian thinkers across Europe. The Mazakinas, 1225-1274. The most eminent Christian philosopher and theologian of the medieval period, was significantly influenced by Islamic philosophers, and especially by the work of the Arab thinkers like Avicenna and Aquinas. Aimed to bring Christianity in line with the philosophy of Aristotle, thus forming a new synthesis of Christian theology and the Aristotelian philosophy of the medieval period, and he integrated the ideas of Islamic philosophers into his works. His interaction with Avros ibn Rushd, whose interpretations were later adopted in the organized methodology of medieval scholastics, is well known. The legacy of Islamic learning, the dialogue between the Islamic world and Christian Europe, influenced Western thought for centuries to come. The body of learning these Muslim scholars put together paved the way for Europe's own Renaissance, and laid the first stones of European civilization. The rediscovery of philosophy in ancient Greece and in the 11th century, Latin world had an immediate influence in scholastic Europe, both on the new knowledge of philosophy, logic, and the natural sciences, that in the intellectual rebirth that followed. The 12th century translation movement, the appearance of Arabic numerals, and the work Islamic scholars made to mathematics, medicine, and astronomy were all essential. Islamic education and knowledge furnished the tools and processes. European scholars added knowledge that complemented and expanded their own traditions. Conclusion: the impact of Islamic scholarship on medieval education is immeasurable. Muslim scholars preserved and developed the knowledge of the classical civilizations and made great advances in maths, astronomy, medicine, chemistry, and philosophy. The transmission of this knowledge to Europe, particularly through the translation movement and the intellectual exchanges during the Crusades, played a significant role in precipitating an intellectual renaissance which would pave the way for the Renaissance in Europe and beyond. Islamic medieval contributions enabled all the scientific and philosophical influences that would lead to shaping Western history. The interaction and mutual influence of Islamic, Christian, and Jewish scholars in the Middle Ages provided the germ for the intellectual advancement that undergird the modern world. Objective 2. Medieval Ages. The term Middle Ages was coined during the Renaissance, and the Renaissance historians used the term Renaissance, which means a rebirth, to describe this period. The Renaissance historians were attempting to identify a period or age that was in between two better-known events. Despite the commonly held belief that most progress with science was held back until the High Middle Ages, much of science and learning wasn't held back by theological belief anymore in the early Middle Ages, with the notable accomplishments in science occurring from the latter days of the Roman Empire until the early Middle Ages, particularly in astronomy, medicine, and natural philosophy. At that foundation, further advances in understanding the works of Galen were constructed by and through physicians, theologians, philosophers, and scholars in multiple Christian and Islamic traditions. In the following sections, we shall consider the extent to which education contributed to the growth of medieval science, and how the medieval universities emerged as centers of scientific culture, the increased importance of the scientific legacy from the Old World, and the role of some leading scholars. We will also consider the interaction between science and religion during this period, and how science was pursued in the context of medieval schooling. Medieval science and philosophy. The scientific traditions of medieval Europe were based on the science of the ancient Greeks and Romans, and many ideas and observations were derived directly from the knowledge of the Islamic world, which the Church preserved and developed for centuries. The rekindling of scientific interests during the 12th century in the post-Greek society of Western Europe was the heart of the Renaissance of science, as it had been understood in ancient Greece. The heir to the legacy of the Greco-Roman region, Christianity in the Middle Ages ushered in an era in which the use of Western Europe as an intellectual area survived for centuries. They were translated into Latin, opened for European scholars, and formed the core of scientific study. Islamic literature, for example. Muslims have also been influential in the fields of literature and science, not just through classic works, but also by continuing and expanding their predecessors' scientific knowledge. Al-Khwarizmi's, Avicenna's, and Al-Razi's contributions to medicine, mathematics, and other sciences remained exemplary through the entire medieval period. Their contributed works, originally written in Arabic, had to be translated to be used as a teaching tool. These scholars carried forward not only classical learning, but also added their own discoveries, especially in sciences such as astronomy, medicine, and mathematics. The universities generated in the 12th and 13th centuries had also been on the basis of scientific studies. They were products of the tradition of the scholar schools in which one learned the classics, but they also were the charter schools of a scientific calling in which reason and faith were interwoven. The curriculum at medieval universities was centered on the 7 liberal arts, which included the quadrivium arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, and formed the basis for the scientific work of the period. Astronomy during the Middle Ages. 8.11 Science. The most important field of science in the Middle Ages was astronomy, though the medieval worldview was generally one of geocentrism. As was Ptolemy's Almagest, much scientifically valid work was being carried out in the field of astronomy that would later contribute to the Copernican revolution. Islamic astronomers achieved a significant amount of progress during the 9th and 10th centuries. They revised the Ptolemaic system, constructed better astronomical instruments, and conducted increasingly accurate observations of the stars and planets. For instance, Al-Battani made valuable contributions to knowledge of the motions of heavenly bodies, and corrected Ptolemy's astronomical tables. His works were later translated into Latin and had a significant impact on European universities. Universities started teaching astronomy by the 12th century, after classical texts and Islamic astronomy became available to scholars in Europe. The neglect the rest of Al-Battani's works was like that of other Islamic Portugueses, but through them they were translated into Latin and helped interesting mutual knowledge in Europe. In Europe, the stars and the planets started to be observed more systematically by such scholars as Robert Grosseteste c. 1175 to 1253, a development that presaged the coming scientific revolution. The Church's influence on astronomy. The Church did, of course, promote the study of astronomy for religious reasons, because it viewed the understanding of the heavens as being relevant to understanding the divine order, but was also curbing specific scientific claims. The Church was very insistent that the geocentric model was to be adhered to, especially in the later Middle Ages. This model reflected the Christian view of humanity as the focus of God's creation. Nevertheless, during the medieval period, a few scholars had already started to challenge the fixity of this sphere and to consider non-geocentric hypotheses. To give one example among many, the French philosopher and theologian Nicole Orazem was proposing a heliocentric model of the universe as far back as the 14th century, and even put forward the idea that the Earth might rotate around its axis. This was not the accepted view yet at the time, was an implication that people within the limitation of religious dogma were intellectually curious about the cosmos. History of medicine in the Middle Ages. Another major field of medieval scientific advancement was medicine. From the Islamic scholars who has contributed significantly into the field, is found that medicine in the early Middle Ages was largely based upon ancient Greek and Roman medicine, and it was mainly religious in content. Throughout the medieval period, medicinal theory, practice and pharmacological knowledge were widely written and taught, and the works of scholars such as Avicenna and Al-Razi were required readings in the burgeoning European medical colleges. 6. Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, translated into Latin in the 12th century, was the primary medical text in European universities through the 17th century. It offered an extensive summary of medicine, covering the diagnosis and treatment of diseases, the action of drugs, and the knowledge of the human body. Avicenna's writings also contributed new perspectives on the causes of illness and the value of noting the symptoms and medical history of the patient for the purposes of diagnosis. Ahra's medical etymologies also have resonance in Europe, including his differentiation of smallpox from measles. His modes of clinical observation and patient care were adopted by other European doctors and assisted in the advancement of medical practice. While the Middle Ages transmitted Islamic medical knowledge to Western Europe, expanding the knowledge of anatomy, it also engaged a range of texts from antiquity that provided commentary on, or revisions of, standard medical practice. Salerno in southern Italy was another significant area of medicine. School of Medicine in Italy. The School of Medicine in Salerno was the first institution of its type to provide a systematic medical curriculum based on Greek and Islamic medical teachings, which was developed further in the medical schools of southern Italy, for example, at Palermo, and after a period of transfer and addition in France, matured in the medical schools of Paris and Montpellier. The medical school at the University of Bologna, as well as those at the medieval universities of Montpellier, France, and Salerno, Italy, were also among the first to also issue a graduate degree in medicine. While medical instruction was for the most part derived from older authors, efforts were made to improve medical practice by close observation and even by examination. French medicine was especially excellent in the study of anatomy and surgery. Belloc and Hilaire. The Inquisition on natural philosophy, alongside astrology and medicine. One of the most important elements of medieval education was the study of natural philosophy, the predecessor of what we now call science. The science of the natural world was grounded in the writings of Aristotle, which formed the core of medieval scholastic thought. Theological and intellectual background. Aristotelian, natural philosophy that included principles of empiricism and logic laid a framework for studying the Creator's physical world. Intellectuals, like Roger Bacon (1214–1292), contributed to the shift in Geist toward a more empirical attitude to science. Bacon, a friar and philosopher, had advocated that science should be studied through experiments and empiricism. He was an advocate for the empiricist nature philosophy and supported observation and experimentation in the study of nature. His contributions prefigured many of the concepts which later emerged as part of modern scientific methodology. Bacon's work in optics was particularly important, as it contributed to a debate between those who believed in the study of vision and those who did not. He was widely read by medieval European scholars in Islamic and Christian lands, and his influence was felt in various fields other than history, including philosophy, theology, mysticism, and science as well. Francis and the Unity of Written. Trjds. A.D. Arthur Skelton, the medieval scholar. The extremes of the scholastic debate between science and religion, faith and reason. The relationship between faith and reason marked one of the distinguishing characteristics of medieval science. In the Middle Ages, science and religion were not separate categories. Intellectuals believed that God had created the natural world, and that analyzing it might help them better understand what they called the divine. Science itself was often invested with religious significance, with many scholars considering their work as a means of investigating the mysteries of creation. The Church encouraged observation, especially if it confirmed religious precepts. There were, however, some frictions between new scientific findings and the doctrine of the Church. For instance, heliocentric theories advanced by figures like Copernicus and Galileo would at a later date be at odds with the Church, as they called into question the geocentric view of the universe. But many medieval philosophers also saw science as a path to a closer understanding of a divine creation, and religious institutions were commonly patrons of scientific inquiry. Medieval science, its heritage, its history, underscored by C.H. Haskins, Ropjivs, Th. Thing, *J, Mufturneps, for gift upi, copyright. Even, although the Middle Ages are frequently perceived as obscure times for science in the popular opinion, intellectual productivity during this period allowed the scientific revolution that took place between the 16th and 17th centuries. Islamic scholarship, the translation of ancient texts, and the establishment of universities contributed to the development of science. Medieval thinkers like Roger Bacon, Niccolò Resmi, Thomas Aquinas, and countless others paved the way for an atmosphere of thought conducive to scientific computation. The medieval focus on reason, logic, and the need to see the empirical came from the need to develop the scientific method, and therefore, a new understanding of the natural world. Conclusion: medieval education in the development of medieval science was also instrumental in defining and advancing the achievements of the age. The medieval universities of Western Christendom were well integrated across all of Western Europe, encouraged freedom of inquiry, and produced a great variety of fine scholars and natural philosophers, including Robert Grosseteste of the University of Oxford, an early expositor of a systematic method of scientific experimentation, and as the Quistioners of the Parisian academies began to form a unified canon of standard works from the 12th century, and more so in the 13th. The teaching of the stars and planets came into its own. Astronomy, medicine, natural philosophy, and science in general were advanced through the preserved and translated work of Hellenistic scholars from the Islamic world in all levels, including that of the scholastics. Though the medieval era is commonly described as a time of stagnation in scientific development, the fact is that the medieval period also saw significant advancement in science. The Middle Ages set in place what would become the scientific revolution, the rise of modern science. Catholic Church dominated all aspects of life and education. As the hegemonic institution in medieval Europe, in the Middle Ages the Church played a very powerful role in molding the intellectual, moral, and social outlook. From the foundation of the Italo-Byzantine Empire in the early Middle Ages to the establishment of universities in the High Middle Ages, the Church added a strong intellectual element to the history of education and made important contributions to the development of curricula, the organization and direction of learning, and the advancement of the systematic study of the state of man. In this lesson, we're going to explore the Catholic Church's concern in the Middle Ages with education, both as an organization interested in the education of its line workers and as the originator of individual schools throughout Europe. We will consider, as well, the connection between the Church and education, particularly in the area of religious dogma v. free thought. The Church as the preserver of knowledge in the wake of the collapse of the Roman Empire. Many of the institutions of learning in Europe also foundered, and literacy rates among the lower classes dropped precipitously. But the Catholic Church was instrumental in saving knowledge at a time of tumultuous intellectual change. Monasteries and cathedrals, being overseen by the Church, were the first libraries, scriptoria, and schools. In the early Middle Ages, almost all literacy that lasted was religious. The Church's aim at the time was mainly spiritual education of the people, so of course its priority was the Bible, Christian doctrine, and liturgy. As a result, there were scriptural studies, the study of Christian theology, and the study of canon law as the basis of the curriculum for medieval education. Monasteries were the early universities of Europe, in which monks devoted their lives to prayer and study. The 6th century rule of Saint Benedict of Nursia, whose order of following Jesus through intellectual and spiritual study set a precedent, highlighted the need for reading and copying texts. Monks made copies of religious and classical works, notably the Bible, and thus the ancient learning probably would have been lost without this rooted effort. It was the Catholic Church which preserved the legacy of learning and academic inquiry in Europe through its control over monasteries, and later also scriptoria, cathedral schools and universities. Indeed, without the church to help preserve knowledge in an age when monasteries were the only route to both literacy and a longer life, it is unlikely that the intellectual revival that led to the later Renaissance could have taken place. The church dominance over education, the clergy and the elite's education. In early Middle Age education was politically dominated by clergy and court, and was limited to elites. For a small minority it reached the monastic and cathedral schools, where a small elite, of mostly the children of nobility, were educated to be administrators of the church, and examined and trained potential bishops and other fungal spores in South Florida church leaders. Church education was religious, but everyone entering these schools studied at least a small amount of the liberal arts, at least enough to go on Catholic church to be priests and scholars. The clergy were educated, and if anybody was going to teach people in the villages their letters or shorter prayers, then they would presumably be the people. A considerable number of monks and priests were educated. Reading, writing, Latin, rhetoric, and philosophy were trained among many, and the intellectual class of society was where the priests and monks. The Catholic Church's school system was vertical. At the top of the educational system, the clergy, with their theological or intellectual background, and at the bottom the lay population, mainly the peasantry, that did not have formal education. Other primary sources in 18th century France. Most peasants were uneducated, and were educated enough just to be able to work the land and survive. Except for urban centers, lower class education was not a priority. Nevertheless, education was considered in the early church as a process that raised the mind and the soul. A belief in education as and a path to salvation underlay the church's attitude. Through knowledge study, one was able to understand God's creation and live a life according to Christian principles. Monastic schools, as the conservator of classical learning monasteries, also had a big impact on medieval education. Few institutions gathered and dispensed knowledge as well. The monks devoted their lives to the safeguard of ancient texts, copying them by hand in the scriptoria, transcribing rooms. This preservation also applied to religious texts, as well as classical writers of antiquity such as Aristotle, Plato, Cicero, Virgil, and others. Such pursuits would have played a crucial role in preserving ancient knowledge in the early Middle Ages. Monasteries did double duty as schools as well as copy centers. The rule formed by Saint Benedict in the 6th century placed a heavy emphasis on prayer, manual labor, and intellectual study, specifically the reading and copying religious texts. Read the Bible, write theological tracts, and engage in profound contemplation of matters theological is what monks were supposed to do. Primarily concerned with theological matters, this intellectual labor eventually led monastic scholars to the study of the classics, science, and other intellectual traditions. The monastic system was especially influential on the first universities that emerged in Europe in the 8th and 9th centuries, because were much like those of today. While the clergy and monks were taught to read and write, and became laypersons, the monasteries of the Carolingian Renaissance played a large part in resolving the handicap of illiteracy, which had been a trait of an underdeveloped Europe. Charlemagne's reforms also had the effect that the Carolingian script, with its improved readability, made manuscripts more accessible. 2. The educational role of the monasteries expanded with the revival of classical learning during the 12th century, when monasteries became places to teach rhetoric and logic, as well as music, poetry, and other subjects that disposed monks towards culture and self-expression. Thus, the monastic schools of the Church were one of the main contributors in making medieval Europe and in laying the academic groundwork for the rise of the medieval universities. Cathedral schools. The origin of formal higher learning from monastic schools developed in the 9th and 10th centuries. Cathedral schools in turn became the roots of the later university systems that emerged in the 12th and 13th centuries. These schools, attached to cathedrals and run by the clergy, concentrated on the instruction of young boys, especially those of noble descent. Cathedral schools were more formal places of education, and a greater distinction than previously existed grew between the two. Some early medieval towns had a school for local boys, as well as one for future priests. Cathedral schools quite rapidly became organized and more professional in nature, and paved the way for the institution of university. The University of Paris, for instance, was a cathedral school before it became one of the greatest universities in Europe. Similarly, the University of Bologna and the University of Oxford were turned into universities by papal charters granted by popes in 1158 and 1248, even though they did not hold university privileges except for the faculty of theology. The creation of cathedral schools limited the role of monastic and other schools and defined the initial development of medieval education. Religion had been at the center of monastic schools, and cathedral schools also focused, albeit less directly, on religious studies. All of these centered on the knowledge of Scripture, which was largely illiterate, Europe's sole access to learning and culture. In cathedral schools, the curriculum was broader and more thorough than in monastic schools, and the pupils were in readiness to enter upon the higher studies of the university. Theology and the Church's understanding of Christian doctrine were still the subjects of the most importance. But on the other hand, the program of studies was extended to include secular subjects in preparation for the development of medieval universities. The climate of mind promoted by these schools was that of critical investigation, of speculation, rather than the traditional and semi-exegetical spirit which was to predominate in the Middle Ages. Catholic Church dominated all aspects of life and education. As the hegemonic institution in medieval Europe, in the Middle Ages, the Church played a very powerful role in molding the intellectual, moral, and social outlook. From the foundation of the Italo-Byzantine Empire in the early Middle Ages to the establishment of universities in the High Middle Ages, the Church added a strong intellectual element to the history of education and made important contributions to the development of curricula, the organization and direction of learning, and the advancement of the systematic study of the state of man. In this lesson, we're going to explore the Catholic Church's concern in the Middle Ages with education, both as an organization interested in the education of its line workers and as the originator of individual schools throughout Europe. We will consider, as well, the connection between the Church and education, particularly in the area of religious dogma v. free thought. The Church as the preserver of knowledge in the wake of the collapse of the Roman Empire. Many of the institutions of learning in Europe also foundered, and literacy rates among the lower classes dropped precipitously. But the Catholic Church was instrumental in saving knowledge at a time of tumultuous intellectual change. Monasteries and cathedrals, being overseen by the Church, were the first libraries, scriptoria, and schools. In the early Middle Ages, almost all literacy that lasted was religious. The Church's aim at the time was mainly spiritual education of the people, so of course its priority was the Bible, Christian doctrine, and liturgy. As a result, there were scriptural studies, the study of Christian theology, and the study of canon law as the basis of the curriculum for medieval education. Monasteries were the early universities of Europe, in which monks devoted their lives to prayer and study. The 6th century rule of Saint Benedict of Nursia, whose order of following Jesus through intellectual and spiritual study set a precedent, highlighted the need for reading and copying texts. Monks made copies of religious and classical works, notably the Bible, and thus the ancient learning probably would have been lost without this rutted effort. It was the Catholic Church which preserved the legacy of learning and academic inquiry in Europe through its control over monasteries, and later also scriptoria, cathedral schools and universities. Indeed, without the Church to help preserve knowledge in an age when monasteries were the only route to both literacy and a longer life, it is unlikely that the intellectual revival that led to the later Renaissance could have taken place. The Church dominance over education, the clergy and the elite's education. In early Middle Age education was politically dominated by clergy and court, and was limited to elites. For a small minority it reached the monastic and cathedral schools, where a small elite, of mostly the children of nobility, were educated to be administrators of the Church, and examined and trained potential bishops and other fungal spores in South Florida church leaders. Church education was religious, but everyone entering these schools studied at least a small amount of the liberal arts, at least enough to go on Catholic Church to be priests and scholars. The clergy were educated, and if anybody was going to teach people in the villages their letters or shorter prayers, then they would presumably be the people. A considerable number of monks and priests were educated. Reading, writing, Latin, rhetoric, and philosophy were trained among many, and the intellectual class of society was where the priests and monks. The Catholic Church's school system was vertical. At the top of the educational system, the clergy, with their theological or intellectual background, and at the bottom the lay population, mainly the peasantry, that did not have formal education. Other primary sources in 18th century France. Most peasants were uneducated and were educated enough just to be able to work the land and survive. Except for urban centers, lower class education was not a priority. Nevertheless, education was considered in the early church as a process that raised the mind and the soul. A belief in education as a path to salvation underlay the church's attitude. Through knowledge study, one was able to understand God's creation and live a life according to Christian principles. Monastic schools, as the conservator of classical learning monasteries, also had a big impact on medieval education. Few institutions gathered and dispensed knowledge as well. The monks devoted their lives to the safeguard of ancient texts, copying them by hand in the scriptoria, transcribing rooms. This preservation also applied to religious texts, as well as classical writers of antiquity such as Aristotle, Plato, Cicero, Virgil, and others. Such pursuits would have played a crucial role in preserving ancient knowledge in the early Middle Ages. Monasteries did double duty as schools as well as copy centers. The rule formed by Saint Benedict in the 6th century placed a heavy emphasis on prayer, manual labor, and intellectual study, specifically the reading and copying religious texts, read the Bible, write theological tracts, and engage in profound contemplation of matters theological is what monks were supposed to do. Primarily concerned with theological matters, this intellectual labor eventually led monastic scholars to the study of the classics, science, and other intellectual traditions. The monastic system was especially influential on the first universities that emerged in Europe in the 8th and 9th centuries because were much like those of today. While the clergy and monks were taught to read and write, and became laypersons, the monasteries of the Carolingian Renaissance played a large part in resolving the handicap of illiteracy which had been a trait of an underdeveloped Europe. Charlemagne's reforms also had the effect that the Carolingian script, with its improved readability, made manuscripts more accessible too. The educational role of the monasteries expanded with the revival of classical learning during the 12th century, when monasteries became places to teach rhetoric and logic, as well as music, poetry, and other subjects that disposed monks towards culture and self-expression. Thus, the monastic schools of the Church were one of the main contributors in making medieval Europe and in laying the academic groundwork for the rise of the medieval universities. Cathedral schools. The origin of formal higher learning from monastic schools developed in the 9th and 10th centuries. Cathedral schools in turn became the roots of the later university systems that emerged in the 12th and 13th centuries. These schools, attached to cathedrals and run by the clergy, concentrated on the instruction of young boys, especially those of noble descent. Cathedral schools were more formal places of education, and a greater distinction than previously existed grew between the two. Some early medieval towns had a school for local boys, as well as one for future priests. Cathedral schools quite rapidly became organized and more professional in nature, and paved the way for the institution of university. The University of Paris, for instance, was a cathedral school before it became one of the greatest universities in Europe. Similarly, the University of Bologna and the University of Oxford were turned into universities by papal charters granted by popes in 1158 and 1248, even though they did not hold university privileges except for the faculty of theology. The creation of cathedral schools limited the role of monastic and other schools and defined the initial development of medieval education. Religion had been at the center of monastic schools, and cathedral schools also focused, albeit less directly, on religious studies. All of these centered on the knowledge of Scripture, which was largely illiterate, Europe's sole access to learning and culture. In cathedral schools, the curriculum was broader and more thorough than in monastic schools, and the pupils were in readiness to enter upon the higher studies of the university. Theology and the Church's understanding of Christian doctrine were still the subjects of the most importance, but on the other hand, the program of studies was extended to include secular subjects in preparation for the development of medieval universities. The climate of mind promoted by these schools was that of critical investigation, of speculation, rather than the traditional and semi-exegetical spirit which was to predominate in the Middle Ages. The emergence of humanism and the questioning of church authority in education. The waning of scholasticism was paralleled by the rise of Renaissance humanism. an attempt not only to escape out of, but to repossess the cultural heritage of Greco-Roman antiquity in general, with philosophy and various forms of literature history, the Greek and Roman poets in particular. The spirit of humanism was based on the conviction that the classics contained wisdom and models, and that by studying them, they could lead their hearers and readers to moral and intellectual virtue. Humanism also stressed the significance of individualism as it promoted discovering and shaping one's individual talents, creativity, and capabilities. The contrast could not have been more stark with the medieval education system that had been so much focused on religious teaching and a communal reading of holy texts. There are various established ways to mark the historical rooting of humanism. In the European Middle Ages, rediscovery of classical texts. The scholars of Europe in the 14th and 15th century began to rediscover and reread classical Greek and Roman texts. This was made easier by the translation movement of the 12th century, previously started, but which gained in intensity in the Renaissance. The literature of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Virgil, and numerous others was translated into Latin and became accessible to a wider range of people. The humanist scholars who age Russia in the 18 in the original texts as components of ancient wisdom dealing with morals and religious instruction, and instead wanted to read the text as examples of what human nature, ethics, and politics. The fall of Constantinople, 1453. One of the most significant events that helped drive the Renaissance was the fall of the Byzantine Empire in 1453. With the fall of the Byzantine Empire, destroyed by the Ottoman Turks in 1453, many Greek scholars escaped to Italy with important books in ancient Greek text which Western Europe ever since had been without. This reintroduction of classical metaphors provided impetus for the humanism movement, as these texts were made available in Italy in the early 15th century, the effects of which would provide the framework for future education for centuries. The printing press, an invention by Johannes Gutenberg circa 1440, the printing press was yet another radical advance which helped to do away with the medieval educational systems. Books became more available and cheap with the invention of the printing press, which helped spread humanist ideas. Renaissance humanism was a much more quickly copied system, with an increasingly large number of trained people in the era to control the spread of ideas. Although it expanded all over the Western world and many of the Eastern, so the Church could not contain it. The impact of humanism upon education. Renaissance humanism completely revolutionized the European system of education. The humanist educators aimed to develop a system of education for those who shared their own enthusiasm for Judeo-Greek and Greco-Roman studies. 5. Humanist scholarship was like the Hegelian Negro in the Forest 6, something that absolutely refused to be ignored, but could not quite make itself present either. There are a number of ways that humanism has shaped the field of education. Revival of the classical languages. Humanist scholars advocated for learning Latin and Greek as the key to accessing the writings of ancient philosophers, historians, and writers. Unlike medieval scholasticism, which put narrow emphases around theology and Latin grammar for religious purposes, Renaissance humanism placed a great emphasis on the ability to access and read classical literature in the original languages. That resulted in a more subtle, more sophisticated appreciation of the classical literature. A general curriculum. The education of the humanist was not as specialized as that of the schoolman, whose studies were almost exclusively theological. Humanists believed that while theology was important, the focus on rhetoric, philosophy, history, ethics, and the arts would lead to the reform of the Church and the reform of human society. Institutio Oratoria 19.3. Humanist curriculums taught students to think abstractly about human nature, society, and the world, and to cultivate expressive speech and eloquent writing. Education of the individual. Humanism promoted the perception of education as a form of self-improvement and self-cultivation, in contrast to the medieval curriculum that focused on religious duties and salvation of the soul. The humanist curriculum aimed to create well-rounded individuals capable of contributing to the world in diverse ways. This emphasis on the individual and the importance of human potential were key aspects of the Renaissance view of the world and would impact the later shaping of the modern educational system. Humanism and the Church. Although humanists wanted to bring classical learning back to life, they did not want to exercise the Middle Ages religious context. Many humanists, such as Erasmus, were devout Christians, and while hostile to scholasticism, they They approached the classics with a similar faith in their conveyance of a pagan and Christian beauty. Nevertheless, the rise of humanism served to undermine the power of the Church in such things as philosophy, politics, and education. This intellectual freedom was a prelude to the Reformation and the birth of new religious the 16th century sects. The medieval system of education wanes with the growing acceptance of humanism and Renaissance. The dominance of the old types of education, with their emphasis on scholasticism and theology, a new educational system emerged. The humanistic education, the emergence of universities that did not focus on religious studies over science, also contributed to the decline of the medieval university system. Several reasons explain this fall. The ascendance of secular learning, adherents of the humanist school of thought stressed that study of the classical past. Secular learning took precedence. Universities became increasingly diversified and proliferated instruction to include fields like law, natural science, and others. These were backwater subjects in medieval education, but easier to learn, and did not require knowledge of the Church's theological preoccupations, so they pushed the intellectual climate further away from the Church. The Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation, in which Martin Luther first publicly challenged Catholicism in 1517, helped dismantle the Church's stronghold of education, and the Catholic Church had to face new educational establishments that scrupulously stressed independent reading of the Bible and personal interpretation of it, and therefore contributed to shattering the control over religious knowledge held by the Church. The rise of print culture, the invention of the printing press, as noted earlier, transformed the spread of information, and the works of both humanist scholars and religious reformers were spread rapidly across Europe. This broadening of print culture also weakened the Church's grip on knowledge and opened up space for the development of alternative educational systems. Conclusion: the failure, shrink of medieval education, and the rise of Renaissance humanism are a vital change in European philosophy, as humanism, including the study of classical antiquity, the individual, and secular education spread, the hold of the Church over education began to erode. The educational atmosphere of the Renaissance contributed to building the basis of the modern world and began focusing more on personal and critical thinking and exploring human potential. Although the withering away of scholasticism and the medieval education system may appear to introduce a discontinuity with the past, it also inaugurated in some respects an era of humanist learning and knowledge. The effect of humanism on the educational system of Europe lasted for several centuries, and to this movement must be attributed the foundations of modern education and modern thought. The Renaissance, that is the work that began in the 14th century in Italy and spread to the rest of Europe, saw a revolution in Europe's approach to thinking and the spreading of thinking, which had long been dominated by scholars and theologians. The period itself is often described as a rebirth of such classical learning and values. The Renaissance had its origins in humanism, which is a shift from studying God to studying man. We will now consider the relation of Renaissance education to its scholastic predecessor. The new educational establishments, the influence of printing and the diffusion of humanist ideas, and the contribution of Renaissance thought to educational development in the modern world. The transition from medieval scholasticism to Renaissance humanism. The curriculum concentrated on individuals becoming learned Christian intellectuals, giving them the knowledge and skills to promote Christianity and Christian philosophy. Though the seed for the Renaissance was planted in the Middle Ages, the 14th century was the start of a massive mental shift, initiated by humanism. Developed out of the study of Latin and Greek, humanism advocated the independence of secular studies and included such things as rhetoric, philosophy, history, and literature, in addition to religious studies. Renaissance humanists, after rediscovering ancient Greek and Latin, rejected medieval scholasticism. They wanted something more, an education that built in them the habit of critically thinking for themselves, and which helped develop their humanity. Not to mention humanist writers like Petrarch, Boccaccio, and Ficino, of course. They were convinced that exposure to the classics would not only lead to superior education, but also to a better society, producing citizens who are more articulate, more thoughtful, and more in tune with what makes our national culture special. These ideals of humanism had a serious impact on the structure of education, which moved from simply education in the faith, based on religion, to a more secular curriculum. The growth of humanistic schools and university is most important of All was the creation and expansion of the humanist schools during the Renaissance. The Renaissance curriculum was based on the study of the classics, primarily Latin and Greek language and literature, and, to a lesser degree, rhetoric and moral philosophy. Schools established during this time were intended to produce virtuous, educated individuals who could become engaged in the arts, politics, and sciences. Humanist schools. The humanist schools were usually not associated with the church. These schools concentrated on classical studies, and the names referenced include Cicero, Virgil, Horace, and Plato, as well as the teaching of eloquence and the ability to argue effectively. Their educational pedagogy fostered critical interaction with texts and a rejection of passivity toward authority in favor of independent judgment and individual cultivation. The most renowned of the schools, however, was that founded in Italy by Guarino da Verona, 1374 to 1460, and which graduated 3 generations of pupils on the new humanist curriculum. In France, Spain, and England, the new way of teaching went on to take its place in other parts of Europe. Universities. The early humanists all left the university because they recognized that institutions of higher learning, where scholasticism had ruled, were meaningless. Universities, with their theological and legal orientation, eventually adopted humanist values. Close classical studies by the 15th century, however, became something of a craze at several of Europe's universities, especially in Italy. Institutions like Florence, Padua, and Bologna held responsibility for the study of Greek and Latin classics, philosophy and rhetoric. Unlike the medieval emphasis on theology, universities now provided a secular education that included literature, history, and natural science. The introduction of humanist chairs in institutions of learning, many of which are still in existence, created a sense of the discontinuity of time and the sense that the future was open to further evolution before a universal knowledge. New humanist chairs at universities were, and are, the chair of poetry, chair of moral philosophy, chair of rhetoric, chair of history, philology, geometry, etc. The place of printing in the diffusion of Renaissance knowledge. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century changed the way literacy was in Europe and communicated knowledge during the Renaissance. It was scarce and expensive because, prior to the invention of the printing press, books had to be copied by hand. Rich people and members of the clergy were able to possess books and knowledge. The printing press transformed this, making books and other written materials readily accessible, affordable, and able to be reproduced. The printing press facilitated the spread of Renaissance humanist philosophy. Immediate works by Petrarch, Dante Alighieri, Cicero, and Plato were being printed and widely distributed in Europe, making the legacy of the classical world accessible to a wider cross-section of society. Books and literacy. Books also contributed to literacy. Now that books were more accessible, the percentage of the literate population slowly began to rise, with the town middle class being the main recipients of this education boost. With increasing literacy, demand increased for schooling, and schools were organized and faster-growing universities established. The dissemination of humanist works also had a significant impact on the secularization of culture, as non-Latin vernacular works came to play an ever-increasing role in a huge variety of fields, including the areas of science, philosophy, politics, theology, history, and art. As they were translated from Latin to the vernacular, the printing press and dissemination of knowledge. In addition to releasing the classics, the printing press allowed for specialization books, textbooks on everything, medicine, law, and science. The printing of textbooks and scholarship in large quantities led to an educational boom which made knowledge that had been previously inaccessible to universities and students readily available. In consequence, the intellectual culture of the Renaissance emerges. The Renaissance curriculum Rehnquist does not shy away from complicated or controversial topics. It was very much a humanist curriculum, one that aimed to train well-rounded individuals who could both think and do in society. Classical learning was thought to promote equally virtues of civic-mindedness, eloquence, and moral judgment. The Renaissance curriculum was first and foremost about preparing students to be thoughtful, engaged citizens. The course had several aspects. Humanities, Latin and Greek, formed the basis of the humanist curriculum. Students were required to read and explicate the works of ancient authors, philosophers Plato, Aristotle, and historians Herodotus, Livy, poets, Virgil, Horace. The readings in this course supported critical analysis and the art of persuasive discourse. Rhetoric. The Renaissance was an era of great rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking and writing. The ancients held this to be a necessary requirement for anyone who would involve himself in public life, whether he be statesman, lawyer, or artist. Vocabulary. Humanistus word key concept main idea according to humanist scholars. The study of rhetoric was important because it could help people persuade others to lead virtuous lives and to make good decisions. Philosophy and moral education. Humanism. Renaissance education also focused intensely on the humanist, or the study of classical literature and philosophy, in particular, the works of Plato and Cicero. Philosophers of this sort were regarded as guides of life's conduct, and their views about virtue, justice, and the best way to live set the tone for Renaissance ethical thought. Education was seen as a vehicle for building character and instilling a sense of moral virtue for the purpose of contributing towards the betterment of humanity. History and politics. Humanist writers thought they could better understand human nature and society if they studied history. Ancient historians, including Thucydides, Polybius, and Livy, were read and studied in important Renaissance treatises of political philosophy. Authors such as Niccolò Machiavelli and Thomas More are significant figures. History and politics were regarded as fundamental to the education of a citizen. The sciences, although humanist studies were the chief, even sole component of the curriculum. The Renaissance in all areas also saw a major development of the study of natural sciences. Academics such as Leonardo da Vinci, Nicolaus Copernicus, and Galileo Galilei would produce many of the standard texts in anatomy, astronomy, and physics. The priority placed by humanists on the desert tradition of study, pioneered by Greek scholars such as Alexandria, rounded off the Reformation's otherworldly knowledge of God and set the stage for the scientific revolution. 800 years later, legacies of Renaissance education. The Reformation of education of the Renaissance penetrated profoundly into the education of Western civilization. The other result of the emphasis on classical arts is the institutionalization of education, which consisted of the organization of curricula and the opening of schools, classes. The humanist focus on an education that is broad and liberal was the foundation upon which modern educational systems were developed, especially in Western universities. In addition, the Renaissance and the revival of classical learning added to the development of science and intellectual accomplishments, two developments that would extend into the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries. This humanist interest in individual reason and empirical observation helped to nourish intellectual currents that would eventually lead to modern science. Philosophy and political theory. Summary. The Renaissance had matured into a full-blown explosion that had changed the course of history as it concerned education. Transition from late medieval scholasticism to humanist education was sponsored by the development of the humanities disputatio, wherein human understanding of natural principles gained a greater understanding with each generational change. In history, thanks to educational advances, it also changed the educational systems in Europe, the effects of which are still felt in the Western world. It is not only the project of redefining education with the humanist culture, but that which made the way for the progress of the universities and the rise of modern educational institutions. Universities in the Middle Ages. During the settlements of the Middle Ages, universities were essentially schools for training clergy, in other words, religious instruction and training in the classical education, particularly theology, philosophy, and the liberal arts. But the intellectual and cultural shifts of the Renaissance significantly broadened the role and profile of universities, creating something close to the contemporary institutions of higher learning that we're familiar with. In this chapter we will explore the history of the university from medieval times on through the Renaissance and beyond, diverting particular attention to the way universities adapted to the circumstances of the day in terms of the evolution of an intellectual tradition and for the promotion of social and political imperatives. We will also think about how the rise of humanism, the spread of new science, and the desire for professional training resulted in the development of academic disciplines and the contours of the modern university. Universities in the age of the Reformation. Universities had progressed from medieval cathedral schools by the time of the Renaissance. These centers had previously been the anchor of the educational system in medieval Europe, where clergy and professional leaders were trained in theology, philosophy, law, and medicine. By the 13th century, the universities of Paris, Bologna and Oxford were established centers of learning, but the Renaissance introduced a new, intellectual climate of humanism and classically oriented studies, and it was evident that universities would have to adjust to different times. The medieval university, heavily rooted in theology and scholastic scholarship, started to transform into a rather secular curriculum based on discursive subjects such as the liberal arts, history, and natural philosophy. The growing appreciation for secular knowledge and the dissemination of humanists' ideas required that universities introduce new disciplines and to have a more diversified and dynamic array of studies. Humanism and the Renaissance universities. The impact of humanism on Renaissance universities was profound. Humanist scholars, such as Erasmus, Lorenzo Valla, and Marsilius Ficinus, established Greek and Latin as the liberal arts core of this educational program. Early modern university curriculums featured the great works of the rediscovered classics from the Renaissance, those of Plato and Aristotle, but also of Cicero and Virgil, and the classic focus on rhetoric, ethics, and history was returning, albeit at the cost for now of medieval-style religious concentration. The point at which culture met the Greco-Roman heritage became the fountain of wisdom, not only about human nature and the hungers of the human heart, but also about politics, society and culture. These new courses on curriculum gave rise to the new classicism and, more particularly, to classical philology, the critical study of texts in ancient history and political theory, leading to the modern discipline of humanities. The emergence of the professional school. The intellectual changes of the Renaissance were not limited to classics and humanities. The growing awareness of the world during the Renaissance required that people know how to educate themselves. The expansion of new disciplines, such as medicine, law, natural science, and others, secured the development of higher educational system in terms of adaptation to the needs of the society. Law and medicine. Law and medical studies in the Middle Ages had been seen mainly in relation to religious and classical texts, but universities introduced more experimental and secular practices into these subjects as the Renaissance deepened. Base aim and institution. Finally, among those were the study of Roman law, such as the works of Justinian and Hugo Grotius, and Roman history, and basic reference to the Bible itself. In the field of medicine, ancient knowledge of the medical texts of the Greeks and Romans, especially the 2nd century work of Galen, continued to be taught in medical schools along new discoveries from the Islamic world. The natural sciences. The natural sciences also began to gain importance during this era, with figures like Leonardo da Vinci, Copernicus, and Galileo pioneering new methods of inquiry into anatomy, astronomy, and physics. Institutions of the academy, such as university created in the Middle Ages, contributed to the development of science as a full-time profession, which formed the sciences as necessary components of dental, medical, and pharmacological education. The heliocentric theory of Nicolaus Copernicus, Galileo's physics, and the work of Andreas Vesalius on human anatomy all radically transformed how we perceive the natural world, and these ideas spread through the university networks. The new disciplines. Besides the newfound attention to the arts, religion, and the natural sciences, the Renaissance brought with it an impetus and curiosity of exploration in many other fields of knowledge. Now the political theory, economic studies, the latter in truncated form, began to form in the writings like that of Niccolò Machiavelli and Jean Bodin. In political philosophy, which up to that time had been very closely attached to the study of theology, there took place finally a liberation. Scholars began to deal with issues of government and statecraft in a non-sectarian way for the first time. These subjects and areas of knowledge became integral to the university structure of the Renaissance, creating a bridge from the medieval to the modern history of times, and thus became what we now call social sciences. Structure and organization of Renaissance universities. The physical and intellectual structure established during the Renaissance was the same still. Many of its proud features were Renaissance additions and adaptations, but many others, although earth-carven in the greatest number of cases, were medieval as to both age and outline, and had been firmly built in their appointed places during a long time before the greatest of epochs began. Curriculum. The curriculum in Renaissance universities were focused around the study of the classics and the humanities, and sometimes sciences, rather than capsulated work in established professions. there was still a place in education for the 7 liberal arts, consisting of grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, but these were supplemented by new subjects like law, medicine, and natural philosophy. The classics, especially Greek and Latin literature, assumed a central role as a humanist. The Renaissance of lost knowledge, when the papal curia invited a renaissance of the lost state and moral excellence of the ancient world, that later tense of uncensored translations from Greek and Arabic, perverted their original meaning. Didactics. The didactic system of Renaissance universities is inspired by humanism, with its focus on rhetoric and eloquence. Lectures, debates, and oratory were used as pedagogical tools, indicative of the emphasis on rhetoric and persuasion. Students were asked to read critically, challenge authority, and communicate their thoughts in an intelligent and affirmative manner. This mode of instruction served to breed independent-minded men. One of the defining features of a Renaissance education, autonomy and patronage. Renaissance universities were commonly financed by wealthy patrons, including local rulers, monarchs, and wealthy merchants. Their support enabled universities to remain independent and to invent new curricula. At the same time, universities were also closely tied to the church, and most of them were located in urban centers with strong ecclesiastical connections. Yet later, in the Renaissance, universities became increasingly secular, and many wanted to free themselves from church domination. Degree systems. The system of academic degrees at the Renaissance university followed the medieval model but began to evolve and offer more degrees. With the advent of the Renaissance university, students now had the opportunity to pursue a wider variety of subjects and to earn degrees in fields that included medicine, law, and the natural sciences. Professional degrees became part of the demand for specialized education in the world of the Renaissance. Renaissance universities and today's modern education was a time of great change at the universities, many of which were redefining themselves and implementing new ways of learning. The Renaissance universities formed the model of the modern university in several key aspects: curriculum broadening, the spread of university curricula beyond the classics to law, medicine, natural sciences, and new disciplines like political science paved the way for a rainforest of academic programs of study in contemporary universities. Rationalization of education. Universities came to be secular universities starting from the Renaissance, and more properly in the 19th century. 12 classical texts. Scientific thought and study of human nature became the means of secular education, as opposed to the ecclesiastical mode of the medieval period. What is the role of universities in society? The experience of European tradition. The universities of the Renaissance taught that education was essential for developing good, virtuous citizens who could contribute to their communities. This concern for civic duty and intellectual growth continues to be the central purpose of contemporary colleges and universities. Revolution of science. The growing prevalence of the natural sciences in the Renaissance, especially the advancements made in the field of empirical inquiry and experiment, would ultimately form the basis for the 17th century scientific revolution. Universities had a very big hand in creating the intellectual culture, which nurtured minds like Galileo, Newton, and Kepler. Phlogistics, Fortune's Academy. You have no new announcements. Conclusion. Renaissance as a marking point in the history of education. It saw universities develop from centers of theological study, with a narrow curriculum of the humanities, into limited secular universities, to which they remain close. The influence of humanism on education was apparent in the extension of learning, the objective of which was to improve the quality of people, while at the same time utilitarian studies served as repressive mechanism. Similarly for secular learning. Beginning in the Renaissance, the modern university model began to take shape, later expanding across the globe with the development of new educational techniques and curriculums that blended classical teachings with new, often scientific, ideas. The intellectual progress of the time sowed the seeds for changes that would culminate in the scientific revolution. The Enlightenment and modern times. The changes in education seen during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance created the intellectual and structural basis on which most education systems were based throughout these periods up until the present day. From the survival and the transmission of the classical knowledge in the Middle Ages up to the humanistic ideals and academic breakthroughs in the Renaissance, These periods of the past constructed our ideas of education, knowledge, and learning. The impact of these intellectual revolutions on education on a worldwide basis is still felt, both in the structure and content of education. In this lesson, we will discover the continued effects of medieval and Renaissance education on today's world. We will consider how the intellectual and institutional developments of these 100 years of scholarship have shaped the emergence of the modern university, its divisions of knowledge, and its values. We will also consider the ways in which these legacies still shape discussions of education and the place of universities in society today. The legacy of the Middle Ages, universities, and scholasticism, 1100 to 1500. Although the medieval school system is regarded as outmoded and too much associated with theology, that it has influenced the foundations of modern school practice should not be undervalued. Institutions that followed the model of the 12th and 13th century foundations in the later Middle Ages seek many of the earliest universities, such as the University of Paris, founded in 1160, and the University of Oxford, in 1167, were also patterned on the scholastic model of higher education. The emergence of universities in the Middle Ages. Universities were established as the new centers of intellectual life. Early universities such as Paris, Bologna, and Oxford were founded to train future clergy, but these institutions quickly expanded to include an array of courses of study ranging from law and medicine to natural philosophy. The academical system, introduced in the Middle Ages, faculties, degrees, and examinations, lives on to a noteworthy extent right into 21st century universities. Scholasticism and liberal arts. Scholasticism, too, for all its faults, has had a deep and lasting effect on the way we educate our young. The scholastic approach, with its principle of dialectical reasoning and its working principle dealing with the reconciliation of faith and reason, was an element of medieval Islamic, Jewish, and Christian thought for several centuries. But it was not the revolutionary new paradigm that conceptual repositioning brought during the modern era. The logic, inquiry, and debate pioneered by scholasticism retains a deep influence even today in academic disciplinaries, and more specifically, the focus of logical argumentation and the way knowledge was sought in an orderly, organized way. These were elements that contributed into the intellectual world, even of the Renaissance and beyond, in the Enlightenment, let's say. In our universities today, we still cherish rigorous and critical investigation and the capacity to analyze and synthesize complex ideas, skills cultivated in the medieval scholastic tradition. The Renaissance heritage, humanism, secularism, and the rise of modern consciousness through the Renaissance, the model of classical learning and, with it, the influence of humanism, radically changed not only education but also the approach to learning and knowledge. And so the epitomes of humanist values, including the worth of classical literature, the pursuit of virtue, the development of the complete personality, continue to animate our values at large in the world of education today. The impact of the humanist tradition on modern curriculum. One of the more lasting impacts of this Renaissance approaches to education is the belief in an all-round or liberal education. The Renaissance humanists tried to form an informed man, not only knowledgeable but also virtuous, who could play a leading part in civic life. This model of the well-rounded person has always shaped education in the modern era, especially in liberal arts colleges and universities, which aim at education for the sake of education, a preparation not for a job but for life, a life in which, it is hoped, the depth of one's development, one's critical thinking, creativity, and sense of the human heritage, the human past, one's disposition towards culture and history are of the utmost concern. The Renaissance curriculum was further developed by the humanists, with the foundation of the liberal arts curriculum, which remains a focus of higher education to this day. This notion that education should equip young people to think critically, to communicate, to be engaged with the world has been a central tenet of contemporary education. Emergence of new academic disciplines. There was also mission, which led to new academic disciplines. Curiosity unconstrained by the dogmas of the past, more specifically, the new fascination with nature, secular history, and natural philosophy ushered in the age of biology, political science, economics, and sociology. The humanists of the Renaissance, who focused on the study of human nature and empirical observation, laid the groundwork for modern science and social science. The growth of knowledge associated with the Renaissance. was to further point toward the development of more specialized universities. The universities of today reflect that diversity, teaching a multitude of different fields that are not just focused on the humanities but also on the hard sciences, engineering, and the social sciences. The Renaissance was a turning point for many people in the type of specialized knowledge that was pursued, and it still influences modern academia. University in the modern world. A 50-year CHRO in Isolitha. Universities of the Middle Ages and Renaissance served as a seedbed for much of the ideals and structure of the modern university. The modern universities of today, especially in the West, continue to contain most of the features in common with their ancient antecedents, which emerged as a result of these historical scholastic drives. Yet even the modern university has changed significantly to meet the needs of the world today. Globalization of education today. Universities all over the world are no longer limited to the elite. Learning in the Middle Ages was only for a select few, a small elite, mostly those from the highest ecclesiastical and noble orders. Modern education, however, attempts to be open and accessible to more of the populace. By now, countless world universities attend students of all origins, especially focusing on facilitating educational opportunities for women, minorities, and historically excluded groups. The history of education during the Renaissance. The idea of democratizing education is the legacy of the Renaissance program of individual development that assumed knowledge is essential for development. The growth of the disciplines, as noted, with the Renaissance, the intellectual territory of universities had widened significantly to include new areas of scholarship. This trend has followed into the modern age, where universities teach in almost every academic education, from traditional subjects such as the arts, law, and medicine, to new subjects such as environmental science, data science, and artificial intelligence. The proliferation of academic disciplines is directly linked to the belief in worldwide learning throughout the so-called Republic of Letters pursuant to the concepts and ideals of Renaissance humanism. The role of universities in society. Universities also have a different role within society. Renaissance universities were centers of intellectual and civic life, the places that trained leaders and thinkers. Today, universities still educate future leaders, but they also conduct research and develop new ideas, new innovations, and new technologies. 21st century universities don't just educate students, they solve global challenges in health, climate change, and technology, as well as the academic and research aspects of their mission. Universities still see the development of engaged and socially responsive citizens as an important priority, reflecting a humanist inheritance, which sought an education for civic virtue. There are still many contemporary universities that believe they have a duty to be concerned with the public interest and the development of respect for moral values. Learning for tomorrow. The impact of technology on education with the advent of the 21st century. Medieval and Renaissance paradigms rooted in centuries of rigorous POTs. Academic traditions have been supplemented by other models and demands as they determine the complex issue of how we learn. Education is more and more about high-tech technology, whether in terms of the way to share knowledge or how to get the students involved in what they are taught. The landscape of universities and classrooms are changing with online learning, the use of digital resources, and a transition to virtual learning. Yet even with these revolutionary changes, the values of education that institution builders set down during the medieval and Renaissance eras, critical thinking, personal development, and the seeking of knowledge for the common good, continue to inform the mission of the contemporary academy. Conclusion. The Middle Ages and Renaissance also saw the establishment of the educational systems that would eventually result in the modern university and academic disciplines. You get the original universities, medieval efforts to retain the classics, the dawn of humanism, an interest in the empirical sciences, and the expansion of curricula during the Renaissance, and all of these epochs played a part in shaping what we mean by education. The enduring contributions of these periods have helped to shape and enrich contemporary learning systems, which remain committed to raising informed and critical thinkers, and such objective is at the heart of educational policies and practices. In the contemporary world, as education develops, adapting to the demands and opportunities of the 21st century, the intellectual and cultural achievements of the Middle Ages and Renaissance remain a potent legacy that still shapes our current understanding and future progress.